Remind members that this meeting will be recorded and ask members to note that mobile phones should be switched off as they interfere with the recording. Tablet devices should be switched to mute, which is FM, then F8. Can I remind members to declare their interests as appropriate throughout the meeting? Also remind members to keep their questions short and concise, with one question and appropriate supplementary per member. We will go around again for further questions as time allows. Members, if you are on the one subject and you're trying to interrogate an issue, I will allow one or two additional supplementaries. What I can't have is you then going on to another topic altogether, and that's basically what I mean by supplementaries. Okay, declare meeting open to the public. Agenda item number 1. Apologies. Are there any apologies? Just can I put an apology in for Robin Swan, because I've just left him there. He's chairing the Chairperson's Liaison Committee group. Any other apologies?
Declan says he'll be here later. He's shown a group of people around.
Okay. Further apologies then. Moving on to agenda item number 2, Chairperson's business. Can I advise members that the planned visit to Caffrey took place on Thursday, 20th of March, and a note of the visit has been tabled at pages 3 to 21 for you members to read up on. It was a very enjoyable visit, very good, very informative. Took us right through all the spectrum of farming, and we met with individuals who were top of their game certainly, and were very passionate and interested in their work. And we also met with students, and it was very refreshing. We asked them questions and they asked us questions, so it was very good. Very good visit. Indeed. Joanne, you want to come on that?
Yes, thanks, Chair. Just want to reiterate what you said. It certainly was a very useful visit, with my son, my husband and my father-in-law all being past pupils of Greenmount Agricultural College, and still, my father-in-law is 82 now, and how fondly he remembers his time there. Very useful, particularly like the tour around the new dairy unit, and meeting with the students was very beneficial. Particularly impressed to see so many young women taken up degrees and careers in agriculture, and I think John Fay did say they had quite a large uptake, particularly around young women, and that certainly was to be welcome. So could I just put on record my thanks to Stella and Mark and the team for organising it. Thoroughly enjoyable and very useful afternoon.
Okay, any other comments?
Well, Chairman, I would echo what yourself and Joanne have said. I think it was a really worthwhile exercise, and John Fay and his staff were very welcoming and very informative towards us, and I think it was good to see it firsthand what it has been offered for students. The only concerning aspect is that for some people that want to go into farming as young farmers at the moment, the criterion is such at the moment that so many people are applying that at least the minimum is almost 7 GCSEs to get into a minimal course, whereas in the past the criteria was 4 GCSEs. And that's the reason yesterday Paul McGuinness asked the question, was there any intention by the department to increase the number of places at the college for students, because we don't want young farmers that want to go into full-time farming to be deprived of an opportunity to go there because of academic criteria. Thanks.
Okay, I agree.
Could I just come back, and that's a very valid point that the Deputy Chair makes, and I know a lot of the skills, particularly young farmers, are learned through the generations, so I think we do not want the bar set too high to deterrent, because some are very good, the skills that they are learned, but yet maybe if it's set too high, then they wouldn't meet that criteria, and we certainly would be depriving them and our industry of some very good young farmers out there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on then. Can I advise members that I and Joe Byrne, the Deputy Chairperson, met with the Health and Safety Executive this morning to discuss their plans on the development of their new Farm Safety Action Plan and its formal launch on the 7th of April 2014. Members will be receiving an invitation to the launch and are asked to note that it will be on the 7th of April in the Sturm Hotel. The lunch will start at 1 p.m. with a light lunch from 12:30. Both the DARD and Deputy Ministers will officially launch the new Farm Safety Action Plan. Members will receive an advanced embargoed copy of the new Farm Safety Action Plan prior to the launch. The Deputy Chairperson and I offered the assistance of the committee to the Health and Safety Executive on any relevant aspect of the new plan. Can I just re-emphasise, members, that advanced copy is embargoed and certainly would want this to have the biggest and greatest impact out there. So it will be launched on Monday, and then obviously it'll be embargoed to have the biggest impact. So if members can respect that embargo, even though they have an advanced copy of the new safety plan. Okay, members, moving on then. Agenda item number 3 is minutes of the meeting, the 18th of March. Can I refer members to draft minutes of the meeting at pages 6 to 10? Are members content that the draft minutes are accurate? If so, I will sign. Agreed? Okay, thank you. Okay, agenda item number 4 is matters arising. Can I refer members to matters arising at pages 13 to 16? Are members content to action matters arising as suggested in the index sheet at page 12? There are 2 items, members. Are members content?
Yeah.
Okay, agreed. Okay, agenda item number 5 is reservoirs bill, the clerk's memo on key issues. Can I refer members to the memo from the clerk at pages 18 to 23, which details the key issues to be explored during oral evidence sessions and allocated questions for members. Now, members, I will pick up the slack and ask the questions that haven't been asked or ones I deem that should be asked. But certainly, if you can, please keep an eye on your own questions and ask them. Some of them may not be relevant. Some of them will be, though. But again, it won't do any harm asking the question, even if we do suspect that they're not relevant, because it paints us the biggest and widest picture that we can have in order to scrutinise this bill. Can I also refer members then to the memo from the clerk at pages 35 to 36, which are potential topics to explore on at pages 37 to 39, and the briefing papers from the Institute of Civil Engineers at pages 40 and 44. Now, can I ask members to seek to ensure that as many of the issues as possible on pages 27 to
37
to 39 are covered? If you all go to that page now, 37. Sorry, technology. 37, you can see the potential topic and questions for the Institution of Civil Engineers. So they are questions that the staff have prepared, all 18 of them, that really do need to be covered in this session for the civil engineers. So if I can ask you just to have a wee think there and even indicate to us if you're happy enough to ask some of these questions, and even because there's 18 of them, even a group of questions.
Actually, question 1 if you want, John.
Okay, but can we have it, Joe? Maybe you take question 1, maybe 1, 2 and 3 maybe?
Okay.
That's okay, we'll do them in groups of 3 if that's okay.
Chair, can I just apologise? I have to go for file questions at 2.
Okay, that's no problem. I know that some others will have to.
I would have it in about a 10 past 2.
Yes, okay.
Maybe now 10 past.
Yeah. But even if you select your questions, and then what we can do is if you are out, you may well be able to come back before the end of the session. If that is the case, we're going to wait. You coming back in?
Sure, I quite like the operating regime from 9.
4 and
Okay, so
4, 5 or
4, 5 and 6. Ian, and then Joanne, you says 9.
The operating regime, yeah, and maybe 10 as well. The visits leads into 9 and 10.
Okay.
And 11, sorry, maybe.
Sorry,
9.
go for 9, 10, 9,
Yeah.
10, 11. Okay, could we have
12.
Sorry,
I like 12.
12,
I'll take 7 and 8, Chair, and that'll
7 and 8.
up there, yeah.
That'll fill the gap. You're 12, 13, 14.
Okay.
Well, I can push you to that. Is that okay? Any other members want to ask?
What's left?
What's left is through Williams 12, 13, what were you, sorry?
12, 13, 14, yeah.
12, 13, 14, so it's the last page. Oliver, 15, 16, 17, 18. I can give you all 4 if you wish.
Aye, well, I'm going at 2 for question time, but
We'll be back and we'll
back in again for the...
Again, if you're in danger of missing, if you have to go out and you're in danger of missing your slot, I will certainly ask the questions on your behalf. There'll be no problem that way. Okay, members, I think these are thorough questions that we need to get through. And also then, remember, you have your questions that may well be appropriate, your normal questions. Let me see, where are we now? Can I also refer members to papers from the department which can be found at pages 23 to 37 of the tabled papers? Members will recall that information was requested from the department on the following: the differential between risk assessments for Northern Ireland and those proposed for England, Scotland and Wales, the proposed review, appeal and dispute mechanisms contained in the bill, the effect on a stop notice whilst appealing the decision to serve one, and the differential between the proposed supervising and inspecting engineer regimes for Northern Ireland and that which is proposed for England, Scotland and Wales. The information contained in these papers will be useful for members during their line of questioning to the civil engineers also. However, please note that the methodologies for risk assessment for Scotland is at draft stage and therefore not to be shared or distributed outside of this committee, because it's still in draft stage in the legislative process in Scotland. Okay, members are clear. Now, those pages are tabled at pages 23 to 37 and may well add the context to the questions that you have been allocated. So again, if you can't just view those as we go along. Can I also refer members to the notes of the table discussions at the Reservoir Bill stakeholder event last week at pages 24 to 26, which members may find useful during the evidence sessions also. Can I seek agreement for the notes to be issued to the attendees of the stakeholder event and add them also to the committee website?
Agreed.
Can I also ask members to note that one of the attendees at the event, Mrs Denise Corbett, has now requested to give oral evidence, and this is being arranged for next week. She is not a reservoir owner, but is very concerned for the environment and the local ecology if reservoirs are decommissioned due to the impact of this legislation. Which is good news, members, because we were fretting over getting people like Denise and other owners up in front of us. I believe that the stakeholder event was a huge success, and can I just say thank you for Stella and the staff.
Mostly the staff, they've done all the hard work.
For arranging it and for formatting it in the way we did. And we got really good feedback, and there were some people there who were passionate. And can I also say that I was taking phone calls, as other members were the week before, from people who were concerned and worried about this legislation, only because we had written to them.
Yeah.
And they had either missed the consultation first time round by the department, or they'd missed the warning letters, or they had ignored them. Some of them had ignored the warning letters because they didn't think that it applied to them because they had a lake instead of a reservoir, when really they did have a reservoir. So I think it's very, very important that we were able to do that. Joe, you want to come in?
Chairman, I agree with you. One of the concerning aspects, however, was that some of them claimed that they knew nothing about it, and they were blaming the Rivers Agency and DARD for not effectively getting in touch with them. And we have to be careful that we weren't in some way getting some of the flack only. Thanks, Chairman.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think what we done was we were able to explain to them on the night exactly the committee's role, which is very good for us also, because it educated people, informed people of the actual process, and it wasn't a done deal, and they could influence change still at this stage. Tom?
Yeah, Chair, I think if there's one thing we saw and learned from that event, is that there's a heck of a lot of work to do with this bill before it comes forward to the floor of the House, because let's remember, when we talk to those people who have reservoirs and what they deem not to be reservoirs, if you like, on their land and their property, they had a lot of concerns, a lot of issues were raised, a lot of genuine issues, and I do believe that we have a lot of work to do on this. I do believe there are a lot of changes to make to it before we can even see it come forward for approval at the Assembly for final approval.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Any other questions, members? Queries? Okay. There's also a reply from the Department of the Environment from a planning perspective at pages 27 to 30. I consider the second paragraph on page 28 to be key, where it says the developer must provide assurances regarding reservoir safety, and if this is not forthcoming, planning permission will be refused. However, as most reservoirs are already high risk, this planning issue is going to apply to very few reservoirs. And that's something we will have to tease out also. There are also written submissions from Mr David Barr at pages 31 and the Wilson family at pages 32. 2 members of the Wilson family was present at the stakeholder event. The designation process flowchart can be found also at pages 33. Okay, members?
We're in the back there, so
I'll just give you a few seconds, members, just to get your questions all lined up, and also your routine questions, if they may well apply.
So we could probably do the correspondence.
Okay.
And the other group might have too, so we could probably do the correspondence.
Okay, members, the evidence, the presenters are running late, so we will move on to item number 8, which is the correspondence. Can I refer members to correspondence received at pages 48 to 69? That will give members enough more chance then to look at their questions. But if I can get you to turn to pages 48. Are members content to action correspondence as suggested on the correspondence index sheet at page 47? There are 6 items.
Well, Chairman, just on number 2, the Ulster Farmers Union in relation to Nemea. I think it's fair to say that Nemea, we had them here in recent times, but there's still a lot of concern still from the actual beef processors themselves. And there is a feeling that there is a shield being used, i.e. Mr O'Neill and Mr Campbell-Tweedy who were here, and that we're not really getting to the heart of the matter by the people who actually own the 7 big meat plants that account for 90% of the processing. Just to note that.
Yeah, and again, if you look at media speculation this week, they're suggesting that maybe the different meat, the abattoirs and the meat processors could go and do their own thing and bring separate strands in. So again, I think that's something the committee will have to look at very, very carefully. Joe, you will be aware that we have written to or we are writing to the main supermarkets, and then obviously the grocery code adjudicator, just to get their slant on it and where see if we can actually find out where the pressure is actually coming from and who is actually applying the pressure, which I think is a very important point.
Yeah, just on the day that Mr O'Neill was here and Mr Tweedy, I did ask them who was looking after the marketing of Northern Ireland beef beyond the 6 counties. And there seems to be a grey area about how effective or otherwise that marketing is, because if 50% of all of the animals killed is purely going into minced beef, burgers, that isn't a very high value-added premier branding exercise. But there is a question about how much coordinated efforts have been made to have a successful marketing of Northern Ireland beef. I'm told by members of the House of Commons that every week there is Scottish beef on the menu, there's other sorts of Gloucester beef or sheep and lamb, but there's none directly being done for us, and I think it's a serious issue that's going to have to be examined. Now, that's the reason I greatly admire Hannon Meats, because Hannon Meats are doing a very tailored marketing and exercise for the hotels, catering and restaurant trade in the Greater London area. And maybe, Chairman, it might do no harm if sometimes we formally invited Mr Peter Hannon of Hannon Meats to come here and appraise us of how he goes about marketing with Hannon Meats, because they are getting premium prices and they're paying premium bonuses to their farm suppliers. Thanks, John.
Okay, maybe something for the future then, the forward work programme. Members content. William, you want to go?
Yeah, I think in relation to meat plants and the processors, it's quite obvious that they all seem to be able to do the same thing on the same morning. They're independent of each other, we're told, but they all seem to make the same decision on the same day. So obviously there's a level of and a degree of working together and making decisions. And in relation to the residency issue, we're told they tell us there's only 4% of of animals that fall into this category. Still in all, they are proposing to impose big cuts. So they're certainly dictating to the market, and they're trying more and more to get a degree of control. So we had the livestock some of the auctioneers here, and it is trying to cut out the live beef market by doing this too. So it looks on the face of it that meat plants are trying to get more control than they actually even have, and they've a lot of control at the moment, but they want to have total control.
Okay, Ian.
Thanks, Chair. Similar to what William was saying there, I heard you asking the question yesterday in the chamber too, also, about the 28 day, I think it was, selling cattle at the market, and having whoever buys them has to hold them for 28 days before they actually go to the abattoir. That wasn't said on here today, as far as I can remember, in the presentation.
Sorry, 30 days.
30 days.
Residence,
30
yeah,
days.
yeah, before.
As far as I was aware, I didn't pick that up on the day that they come in and did their presentation. Am I right in saying that? Or?
Yeah, no, it is a big issue, yeah.
So it's a big issue, and they deliberately avoided presenting that situation to us on that day. And what I'm asking is there, that this committee here maybe should speak with one voice, and I think we are all of one voice on it, and we should be maybe very vocal and very strong, with NAMEA regarding this. That was the will of the chair.
No, certainly we've certainly agreed. We've heard from the NAMEA, we've heard from the auctioneers, and I think we've responded well in regards to the actions that we have proposed to do, which is right to the supermarkets and the adjudicator to see where they sit, where the pressure's been applied. We can certainly do more work on this once we get the responses back, to see what comes out of those responses. But I must say, I think this committee is very much of the mind, in one mind, that we need to apply pressure for the sake of the beef industry and the producers in that sector. And I must say, certainly at question time yesterday, the Minister was no doubt also where she stood on it. So again, I think we're all singing from the one voice.
I think we should show that, really, in this particular instance,
Yeah, no, I agree.
You put it ahead of it.
Okay, members happy enough? Okay. Could I move then, maybe we'll take one more item, which is the Forward Work Programme. Can I refer members to the Forward Work Programme at pages 71 to 75? Can I seek agreement for the Forward Work Programme as it sits?
Chairman, just one item, maybe consequent to that. We in the past we've had the Northern Ireland Agricultural Consultants Association come to us. Now, a lot of them, quite a few have been in touch with me, including the officers of the organisation. A lot of them are still concerned that there is no clearly defined guidelines, and they have made representations to me, and I have told them to write formally to the committee. I think they're meeting tonight in Cookstown with a view to them formally requesting that we maybe receive another presentation from them, because I think they collectively have to make sure, along with us, that the guidelines are refined as quickly as possible and issued with no ambiguity. Thanks, Chairman.
Single farm payment? Form
Yes, the
filling?
2014 applications.
Okay.
Okay, members agreed?
Agreed, yeah.
Okay, members?
I think the Lig and Ale are on their way in, so we'll take them first.
Okay.
Just maybe about 2 or 3 minutes, if you don't mind.
We're going to read. What are we going to?
Lig and Ale first, did you say?
Yeah, they're available and they're coming first.
They're okay now? Okay. Yeah. Take. Okay, agenda item number 7 then is the Reservoirs Bill, oral briefing from the Lig and Ale Improvements Association. Can I advise members that there are no briefing papers have been provided for this session? Can I also refer members then to their allotted questions? Not the civil engineers questions, but the allotted questions that you'll have in your bill pack that you ask on a routine basis every week. I haven't got my bill.
Page 18 of your pack.
Here.
I'll give you mine.
You can get one. Go.
Yes, the 18. The 18 of yours.
Oh, yes, okay.
Was that yours? What's mine about? No. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, can I welcome Damien McCallum, Environmental Recreational Officer, and Dr Jim Bradley, Belfast Hills Partnership Manager. You're very welcome to the committee, gentlemen, for what is a very important session, obviously, with regards to the Reservoir Bill. Jim, obviously I met you, you were at the table at the stakeholder event. I hope you found that very, very useful. Damien, I don't think I've met you yet. Maybe you were at you were the other group. Yeah, I suspected that, so I didn't. I was probing there more so than anything else. I hope you both found it very, very useful that night, and it prepared you then for this presentation here now. If I can ask you to take no more than 10 minutes to address the committee, and then the members will go into questions on that. So without further ado, everyone's.
Okay. First of all, I'd just like to thank the committee for the opportunity to come along and speak to you and be involved in the process. As you already mentioned, my name is Damien McCallan. I'm Environment and Recreation Officer for Ligonene Improvement Association, and this is Dr Jim Bradley, from the manager of Belfast Hills Partnership, who is also an environmental committee member for Ligonene Improvement Association. Let me just explain a wee bit about Ligonene Improvement Association. We're a charitable community organisation founded in 1974 to improve the well-being and environment of the residents of Ligonene. Our main activities include community development, regeneration work, education, health and well-being, community relations, environmental work, advice and welfare, and youth development work. In addition to the above list, LIA is the lead partner for the delivery of the Government's Neighbourhood Renewal Strategy. This strategy is applicable to those wards across NI which fall into the top 10% of deprived, disadvantaged communities. The Ligonene ward is listed as number 57 in regard to deprivation. We've provided you with some photographs. And if you just look at page 1, it gives an aerial picture of the 4 dams that are located in our area. I'll give you a wee brief spiel on who owns each of the dams. So the middle dam, Wolf Hill Middle, is owned by Ligonene Improvement Association. We have a fishing club which uses it, over 100 members. The upper and lower dams, we believe, are owned by O'Kane's Limited, who are involved in the ongoing development of housing, and we have a good working relationship with them. Boodles Dam is at the other side of the Ligonene Road, is located in Ligonene Park, which is under the ownership of Belfast City Council. A wee bit about what we're doing at our dam and what's being achieved. We have been upkeeping the dam for over 10 years now, since we've purchased it. We've set up a cross-community fishing club right on the rural urban fringe. We have also created and developed a network of connecting footpaths and key facilities, including Rural Development Programme funded paths and key links to other public sites. If you have a look at photos 3, 4 and 5, you'll see an example of some of the work that's been recently completed on location. We also have interpretation panels, heritage panels, an example of which is photo number 6. The dam and the dams in the Mill Race are very important to us from a landscape, biodiversity, heritage and community development point of view. We have a range of other projects and events working with local schools on environmental education, all cross community as well. These projects and developments have been funded by a kaleidoscope of different funders, including Heritage Lottery Fund, Department of Social Development, Belfast Hills Partnership, Rural Development Programme, Landfill Tax, Northern Ireland Environment Agency and the Belfast City Council, amongst others. We have plans to further develop the site and the links to other public sites, and are in the process of redeveloping an old corn mill on site. The plans are with the planners at the minute. The idea being that this will provide an environmental centre, a hub for the local the activities on site, and for the groups that use the site as well. I'd like to pass you over to Jim.
Thank you. Just to talk about Wolf Hill Middle in particular, we've been told that's been classified as high risk. I could imagine, although we don't know because we're not owners of the other sites, that at least 2 others of those dams in the Ligoniel area are also likely to be high risk. There has been a survey carried out on Wolfhill Middle at around the time of Ligoniel Improvement Association purchasing this site. That was linked in with the housing that you can see on that's occurring on the aerial photograph. And planning service had stipulated that a survey needed to be carried out. There were some actions identified and were carried out to planning services satisfaction. Ligoniel Improvement Association have been considering other surveys, particularly when some of the new DSD paths were being put in last year. I have to tell you that getting grant aid for this type of survey work isn't easy, and Ligoniel Improvement Association and ourselves have, as you can see, experience in working with a whole range of different funders. It's a little bit more difficult than it might appear to get grant aid funding, particularly depending on how much we're actually talking about, what type of work it's for. We've just got 2 or 3 concerns to particularly point out to the committee. The figures that has been indicated to us in terms of annual costs, £4,500 to £8,000. This will be a millstone around the neck of community groups such as Ligoniel Improvement Association. Those figures are actually larger than the unrestricted reserves that LIA have at the minute, given all their project work. We're aware that there are future comments and plans about possible grant aid, but that's cold comfort for the likes of Ligoniel Improvement Association. In particular, even if that was in place for the first few years, questions would have to be asked about how long that would be maintained for. One particular issue that we have is the classification of high, middle and lower risk. And it's the word risk. We're not risk management professionals. We do deal with risk management, and our common understanding is that risk is the potential, perceived, estimated impact of an incident multiplied by the probability of such. And in that case, if you can lower the probability, you're lowering the risk. What we believe is actually being classified here is potential impact. And the proposal that you would nominate a reservoir as being high risk, and always high risk depending on volume, but particularly in terms of housing below possible inundation routes, should there be a failure of that dam. We see the use of risk as being extremely difficult. You can imagine the scenario whenever we're trying to explain to some of these residents that this is nominated as a high risk, but that the engineers have said that they're only going to carry out surveys every 10 years and they're satisfied with the situation. That's quite difficult to communicate to residents. You could, for instance, have 2 high-risk reservoirs in the area, one which needed urgent attention and one that didn't. But would they still be called both be called high risk? So we see that as a problem. Also, if you're looking at organisations, we get a lot of organisations similar to Ligoniel Improvement Association who come to look at what has been achieved there and what might be possible in their own area. We believe that if the reservoir bill goes through with relatively few changes, we'll get much less of those potential groups. We're also very aware that if the bill went through in its present form, that the advice that we would have to give would have to be extremely guarded. And I would ask you to consider what a director on a board of an organisation such as the Ligoniel Improvement Association would have to bear in mind if such a proposal came to a board. It would be extremely difficult to take on or to decide to take on potential liability and what might be potential increasing liability in the future. Can I finish by offering an invitation to the committee, either as the committee or individuals, to come and look at what's actually at stake and what's been achieved at Ligonale, and for you to bear in mind that this bill will have significant ramifications for areas and for developments such as we have in Ligonale. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, and thanks very much for being so concise and succinct. Robin, I believe you haven't to go out.
I'm half past, Chair. I've nothing at the minute.
On the ad, even on the planning issues. No, you're happy enough. Ian, do you want to come in with your?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. You said that you own the Ligonale improvements, or the middle one.
Middle one, yes.
Have you had any engineers on site? You know, taking a look at the reservoir and giving an opinion on it. Have you ever had any?
There has been in around 2000.
Right.
There's been engineers up, URS, who were the former Ferguson McIlveen, who had performed the surveys, linked in with the paths. It's at that stage that we were investigating the possibility of carrying out another survey before the reservoir bill came into.
Yeah, and did they identify any problems at the particular time?
No.
And no work of any sort was needed to be done?
They didn't carry out a full survey, as we're talking about, but no, they certainly had no.
But, you know, in this bill here, we're talking about a panel of engineers. You know, these are highly specialised people. So, you know, to employ these people, it seems, you know, that it's going to take quite a substantial amount of money to do that. You know, what you're saying, what I've gathered from your presentation, is that, you know, this will put a burden onto your group that you won't just be fit to meet. Is that
Huge
right?
burden, yeah. Big time. It's something else that you're going to have, as Jim has already alluded to as well. If we were to, if we didn't own the dams and we were presented with this next year and the bill was in place, would we sign up to taking it over? Probably not, if it was an added liability. Added to that, I mean, there's a lot of development and educational programs run up on site. Do they then suffer because you have to put your money into your surveys and things like that? So, yeah, it's a serious concern, and as Jim's already alluded to, we don't have very much money in reserves, so.
Can I make another point on that? We have gleaned estimates of what that cost might be, but if you look at our particular circumstance, would it be that engineers would look at that, and given the number of houses that are below, would the actual cost to us could well be higher? It might be more difficult for them to say we are only going to inspect every 10 years. Yep. And then there's this whole question of who decides whether that judgment is fair and proper, and will they go for the precautionary principle and say we need to come up every 2 years? So this is only a very rough estimate, general estimate, and I'd be concerned that it could be higher for ourselves, despite the fact that there is no indications. Yes, we would like to get a survey, but we'd like to get a survey to show that our dam is in good shape. We do weekly checks in the summertime, and slightly less frequently in the wintertime. We already have an existing regime of maintenance works. That isn't the same as having the full specialist survey, I grant you that. But we can see that cost as being quite a bit higher than that, possibly.
Okay. Tom Buchanan.
Thank you. Given that Ligonale Improvement Association owns the middle dam, it's obviously normal circumstances would be a situation where you're responsible for managing of that. Now, there's no doubt that you do have clubs and other types of associations that use for fishing and water sport perhaps, and that type of thing. So there now appears to be some confusion that the person who uses it, not actually the owner, but the person who uses the water or the dam, that they can be held responsible for the managing of that. How do you see that so far as yours are concerned? Irrespective of who uses it, will you be the sole managers of it, or will it fall back on the person?
No, irrespective of who uses it, we'll be the managers of it. We have a good working relationship with the groups, and they're all made up of local people, and so a community voluntary basis. So, we work with them as best possible.
management decisions requests are put in by the fishing club, given the agreement, and it's the association who actually carry out the work. So it's very clear that Legally Improvement Association are the managers of that particular dam.
Well, you have spelled out I suppose, some of the implications and the ratifications that this bill would have for you folk as an organisation should it go forward in its present form. And there's no doubt there's finance regarding engineers and all that type of thing. What other key issues do you see within the bill that would need to be changed in order for to keep your club or your organisation from going under, if you like, if this bill went through in its present form?
That's very difficult because it's more what's missing, and I can understand that there's a split between what this bill intends to do in terms of health and safety and in terms of future development of open water. And one of my key concerns is in a more general level, the sort of positive development that's important from not just a community but from a tourism point of view really receives quite a knock as far as this is concerned, and not just for community groups but also in terms of councils. And I can imagine many councils having to take a serious look at areas of open water and reservoirs and dams, and my concern would be that you'll see a significant proportion of open water that either exists or presently being used or has the potential to be used and expanded on disappearing in the next few years if the reservoir bill goes through. So I know that's not an answer directly to your question, but that's a key point to make. There did seem to be confusion at the meeting last week in terms of ownership, in terms of what might alleviate, for instance, partially removing, getting under the 10,000 mark. Does that mean that we're taken out of the system altogether? So I would also have the concern about how the bill is interpreted and wrong decisions being made as far as that's concerned. I'm particularly concerned but that if a community group are told that their body of water is high risk, how they interpret that and how the local community interprets it.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Just if I can go through a series of questions. First one, I suppose, is the level that defines a controlled reservoir. Now, again, these are 4 reservoirs in your immediate area, one of which you are responsible for, and the other 2 or 3 aren't. 2 of them are owned by O'Kane Limited, who I believe you said were developers.
Yeah.
Now that in itself brings a curious mix, because you have development, which will change the designation of a reservoir, but yet the developers own the reservoirs. Have you had any conversations or direct links with the O'Kanes on this issue?
Not directly on this issue, but they're linked in with the plans for the corn mill and the environment centre and visitor services as far as that's concerned. And I know it's not quite what you asked, but if you look at the aerial photograph, you can see that the housing that's has been developed below our dam is all fairly new.
Yes.
So what's happened in our area in the last 10 or 15 years, exactly what you're asking is what would happen if this was repeated in other sites.
Yeah. Basically, more development around the site which you are not in control of.
Yeah.
Will lead to a higher designation if you haven't already reached that.
Can I also point out that Wolf Hill Upper is quite a higher level than Wolf Hill Middle. If that failed, it would go into our dam.
Yes.
And they would go into the so you've got 2 dams that are I suppose there's a joint risk involved there.
They all seem to be on the aerial photograph, all differing sizes and scales. Are we sure that they are 4 reservoirs that meet the correct scale, the 10,000?
Well, ours, the middle dam definitely does.
Yes.
I'm not sure about the rest of them off the top of my head. I would imagine Woodville Lower doesn't fall into the classification.
It is in the audit list.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
And even if it did fall below the 10,000,
Might be
there's
in there.
provisions within the bill to bring it in
Yeah.
if it's deemed to be high risk, as far as my understanding. So size really in a built-up area doesn't really come into it
Yes.
to that degree.
And the area to the right of that Wolf Hill Lower, you can see that there's a cleared area. That's where future development
Yes,
by the owners of the Wolf Hill Lower is going to happen.
yes. Are you sure you'll know your own dam pretty well? You'll know the surrounding areas and the levels, but do you know, or have you means of finding out if Wolf Hill Middle was ever a natural lake? And then the differential between the natural lake and then the reservoir water, basically, for want of a technical word.
We know from the old maps that there was no lake there.
Right, okay, so you're talking about 100% reservoir.
The natural river is...
Forth River runs on down behind.
Yeah, Forth River's down behind, but the natural river is parallel to the main road there. So that's the Ligoneel River there, and all of these are fed from springs further up. That's the Wolf Hill Middle is artificial and always has been.
You talked in your presentation about the operating requirements and how it will burden the group, and how it would have considered then if it was looking to purchase this now, how that would all have to come into consideration, and you would probably make a decision of not going ahead because of the burden and I suppose the responsibility to a certain degree. I'm sure you've had a wee dip into the legislation, or the bill as it sits. The bill as it sits. There is this need, I suppose, that government really has to try and prevent flooding and then damage to property and maybe even loss of life. Have you any idea of how that could be done without this bill, or a bill of this nature to do the same thing, but just not in such a burdensome way?
One consideration that I had was that, and it's dealing really with how grant aid might be applied. I realise this, although it mentioned in the associated documents, is not directly related to the bill, and whether bodies of water that are used for public use, whether that's for sport or for environmental education, could be registered in some way, and this is whether you have the bill or not, and then be eligible not for one-off grant aid, rather for ongoing financial support to meet these costs. And I would believe that that's one way of doing it. Yes, I do see, and I would fully agree with the need for some approach that ensures that bodies such as Wolf Hill, bodies of water, are kept safe.
It's kind of the balance between that and the work that's being completed, or the value that we get from these open water. You don't want to lose all that because you're introducing the bill for safety reasons. So it's a balance between the two. How you strike it.
We have no difficulty with the purpose of the bill, and in many ways with quite a lot of the structures that are proposed. It's the fact that it's so grey what happens in our case, and I do think you need to have a clear idea of how to approach both if you're going to properly develop and use the resource that we have here in Northern Ireland.
What about if and I don't mean to at any stage put words in your mouth or answer a question for you, that's not what I'm about, but what if the and you mentioned it, Jim, the additional probability is added in of a failure, and the fact, let's remember, if you're this reservoir owner and engineer comes and says you need to do so much work costing so many thousands of pounds, and you're high risk, and you do that work, you will still be deemed high risk. Is there anything there in the mechanics of that which you've just illustrated that you see? Well, to me, it's apparently it looks to be unfair that even though you've spent and invested money in your dam or your reservoir, it's still then deemed as high risk. You could invest in what could be the Hoover Dam type scenario, but yet you're still high risk, whereas someone down the road may not have invested that money and will still be deemed as high risk.
Yes.
How do you see that? How should that be in legislation? How do we get that route down?
One of the particularly interesting things that I heard last week at your event was that risk does seem to be estimated in other countries for this situation. As I say, we're not engineers, but we're very, very interested in that if that's the case. Yes, we find it difficult. It'd be interesting to hear from the engineers themselves how, if they are able to judge that they need to survey or to carry out mitigation works, how that isn't based on there being higher risk than in a situation where they say, no, we don't need to do that work. So I just find it difficult to combine the two. The other thing I would say is, that just purely in layman's terms, and in terms of not just residents but members of the community groups, users, funders, insurers, this whole use of the word risk, which I believe is really, you're talking about estimate of severity of impact. I think that's getting really muddy in the waters, pardon the pun. But it also means that it's difficult to explain to people why you're carrying out works that in theory don't decrease your risk. It just doesn't seem to fit in with what people would usually expect.
I don't know if you've dipped into the disputes, the appeals mechanism within the bill, whereby you're designated as a high risk, say for instance, and there will be an opportunity to appeal that decision and have a review of that decision. Is it something you've looked at and considered at this stage?
I have looked at that, but we've been told unofficially that this is a great example of a high risk reservoir. Again, just purely in terms of potential impact, as opposed to whether there's a high risk of failure in the near future. So we've looked at that, but not really gained. If that current structure and mechanism of high, low, and medium risk and the criterion upon which it's based, then it's difficult to see how an appeals process would benefit us.
There is also an appeals review process for then if you get the engineer coming out and recommending remedial works, you disagree with that, you think it's too much, you think it's too exorbitant. There is an appeals mechanism for that also.
Yes.
Have you looked at that in any shape or form? Or?
Yes, but the one aspect I would say is that when a professional produces a report like that, we first then have to. I don't even know whether we would be in a position where we'd say we disagree with that.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
as you mentioned earlier, these are highly specialised reports. So I would have a concern as far as that's.
And how can a community group then have the capacity to even contest it? Because then you could end up running into more money to actually prove or contest the findings or recommendations.
I also think that what would happen is that the clock would be ticking. We'd be looking very quickly for funds to do the work.
Yeah.
We'd have a choice to make as far as that's concerned.
You have covered grant aid in your presentation and some of your questions. What one person put to me was last week was that don't talk to me about 50% grant aid. Don't talk to me about 75% grant aid. If we're talking thousands of pounds, you're going to put me under.
Yeah.
How do you feel?
Jim already pointed out in the presentation, I mean, the estimated cost for one of the inspections is higher than the reserves that we hold at the minute, so it kind of highlights how serious it could be if we were left with the responsibility of doing that down the line. So whatever grant aid is put in place would need to be, to cover the whole cost of it, basically. For an organisation like ourselves, I understand there's different reservoir owners out there, but for a community organisation with so much social benefit from the site, it would make sense for for us not to have any bill at the end.
With grant aid, and again, the question is with regards to grant aid is how long does it run? Does it run forever, or is it a snapshot of grant assistance for a period of 2 years after the bill, or 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever, or until you've been surveyed the first time and you've been given this recommendation of works? How do you feel about that? Is it something that should be ongoing, or would you benefit? Would your reservoir benefit of a grant aid assistance for one-off remedial works to bring your dam up to a standard, and that even though you have a burden going forward of a yearly inspection, you would have had grant assistance in order to bring your dam up to a certain
Yes.
certain spec?
Yes.
Is it something that you would, well, tentatively support, or?
Well, I can imagine that receiving grant aid for major mitigation and improvements that have obvious benefits, it would be possible for that to be grant aided. It's the smaller running costs per year that I would find it very difficult to believe that any of the funding bodies we've mentioned already would take on. They're looking for, and it's in their nature that they're looking for positive additionality, extra impact, etc. So to have a hidden cost that they would fund, I would see that as being that bit more difficult. So it would actually have to be up to the departments involved to give a long-term commitment as far as even those small running costs. And remember, as I said earlier, our costs could be quite a bit higher than that per annum. If these were one-off costs, improvements, well, of course, depending on how much you're actually talking about, that actually might be more possible to secure than the smaller running costs. That's what it looks like from our point of view as being a very small organisation.
Okay, when Rob goes out the door, we're going to lose quorum. So we will have to stop. If you can just pause, freeze everything.
Okay.
As the Dick Tracy cartoon used to say. Okay. Okay, Jim, Damien, sorry for that. I do apologise. We just ran out of colour there. We have got it back, so we are able to continue. Again, I'm not 100% sure where I was asking a question or you're answering a question, but nonetheless, we'll move on. I've only one or two more questions just for you, but I suppose, what do you know about flood plans? Because there will have to be a flood plan done for each controlled reservoir, if my understanding is correct. What expertise do you have at the present time of producing a flood plan now? Again, don't confuse that with flood inundation maps.
Right, okay.
But it still will be a flood plan where if something happens, you will be able to take a course of action to, I suppose, health and safety issues, and then also maybe even to try and lessen the impact.
Okay.
What do you know of, or what do you know of a flood plan? Do you have any experience whatsoever on anything like that?
Very, very little. Certainly from a professional or engineering point of view, but we would have between us we would have good knowledge of general risk management and general planning for risk and risk management. So, given the proper data and information as far as this particular issue is concerned, I'm sure we could produce that, but it depends to what level that would need to be produced and whether that would need to be approved by engineers, for instance. I'm sure it would be. And what that would mean in terms of going back to costs again.
Yes. Yeah. Again, we talk about the costs and the burden of the actual work on the reservoir and the maintenance of it. But then we also have the cost with regards to offences, fines, if something was to go wrong, or if you didn't comply. Failure to comply with the recommendations in the engineer's report could well mean a 2-year imprisonment or a 2,500 fine, or both. Is that something that's even managed to get on your Richter scale? Obviously nobody wants to think about things like that.
No, that's the first kind of thing that comes to your mind when we're
Right.
brought on this. You go to worst case scenario in your head, if you know what I mean. And I think that was a big concern for any of the board members we spoke to, was, oh, what happens if, we understand that the risks are involved, but
we've read through the entire document. We realise that there are all these particular points, but it's very hard for us to get past those early issues and problems in terms of high risk and in terms of running costs and the additional burden that would give. We can understand and see the need for that sort of enforcement. We would hope that we would always be in a position where we would avoid that and seek to achieve all recommendations. And so we can understand that it is only right that that should be in place. It obviously does have an effect in terms of board members and liability and what's seen as an additional thing to consider if and when you're talking about doing this sort of work.
When you look in here in the news with regards to some high-profile cases that go to court, and the offences laid down there, some people would say maybe even some very lenient, and I'm talking about issues here like welfare of animals and all sorts of spectrums of crimes and criminality that goes on. With regards to proportionality, do you think 2-year imprisonment for a breach or a non-compliance of an engineer's report, do you think is that?
It's very, very difficult to say. It depends, I suppose, on what's seen as the potential impact. For instance, if you have an entire housing estate below it, that might seem to be that bit more proportionate than some of the other situations that we were talking about last week, where you might have one person and it might be the owner living below that. In terms of proportionate, I would also like you to bear in mind, yes, we're talking from a community group point of view, but we work closely with councils, not just Belfast City Council, and we're aware that these things also weigh on officers' minds. And we have Boodles Dam in Liganeel Park, and it's our concern obviously is focused on Wolf Hill Middle, but we're also concerned about the others and the effect that would have on the whole site in general. So is it proportionate? That's difficult to say. Yes, and also there's what's being raised and what's at the front of the notes on the bill itself, how often this has actually happened. But I realise that it only takes one incident and one event for the whole perception to change.
Understand. Of course, your community groups, you're volunteered, you have panels, you have groups. How much of this is actually on your mindset when you have your meetings, either in Belfast Hills Partnership or an Environmental Recreational Officer within your group, with regards to the Liganeel Improvement Association? How much of this is bearing down on your group? Is this the topic of every conversation, or is it something that's out there that nobody wants to look at? Are people turning their face away? What's the climate out there at the present time?
I think from the Environment and Heritage Group's perspective, it's concerning, yes, but we understand that the issues have to be addressed. But as Jim said earlier too, about the risk and the likelihood of it happening, it all has to be balanced up. And yes, everybody is ultra concerned when you think of the worst case scenario. But as we already said too, the dam's been in operation for X amount of years. There hasn't been any issues. We did have a survey done which didn't throw up any major red herrings. So thinking about it pragmatically, it mightn't be a worst case scenario, what it could. And that's the worry for everybody involved. We want to get it sorted out so that this is a big project for us, a big part of our work and our development in the future. It's a great resource, not only for our organisation, but for the local area and other areas that come into it. So, we're concerned, yes, we are concerned. Is it our every thought, with a wife and 4 kids in the house? No, it wouldn't fit, but it definitely is, on the agenda to be discussed, and people, as I say, without having full knowledge of what's going to happen or what the ramifications of the bills are, you kind of do think about the worst case scenario. So it is concerning for us. It is, yeah, at all levels.
I was aware that at the meeting last week there was a lot of talk about consultation and the consultations that it's gone through, and I do appreciate having been involved in trying to get messages out to communities in general, how difficult that is. I would have to say that there are still members that have not realised the full implications of what's going on here. Those that know can see the problems. We can start to understand what some of the implications are. Is it the topic that everyone's talking about? No. Compared to, for instance, to CAP and ANC, for instance, that's just one example of what's perceived as a current major issue. But we will be reporting this again to the board of the Belfast Hills Partnership and to the Nicotine Improvement Association, and this will come up fairly quickly. But as often happens in these consultation processes, people do arrive late to the game, but we can see quite clearly that this has problems and issues for us, and that if we don't manage to get our voice heard, this could present us with lots of problems.
Would you ever contemplate, or are you contemplating decommissioning of a dam?
Again, it's not as simple as you might think, because that's one of the things that comes to your head. Well, if you're having a problem with decommissioning, but again, that could be running into £500,000, £1 million.
If this is a complete artificial reservoir, you may not be able to fully decommission it, surely, because where does the water go?
Yeah. I think that's part of
Well, that's the other issue. If you do decommission it, then that's what people have been saying. What happens to the water? So, yeah, that's another issue.
Sure, it could be done, but the cost would be substantial. It may well be that we'll be sent away to look at that we'll be looking at all the options, and that's something that we'll be sent away to look at. But that would be a disaster for ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, with regards to, thank you, Stella. With regards to a get-out clause, I know that has been looked at in other various jurisdictions, whereby the bill would see a get-out clause for third sector voluntary groups, whereby, knowing that you could not withstand the burden and the costs associated with the ramifications for the bill, that a government body would come in and take over management in one guise or another. Is that something that would be attractive to you?
I would certainly see that as an option, but I do think there's an in-between. I think it's the word granted is the problem. If the word support was put in, and in a way that was less of a cost than the full takeover by a government body, I think there's a middle way. There might be a middle way to do it, there might not, when you look at the practicalities. But I would see that as being a good option to look at first.
Okay, Joe Byrne.
Sorry about behind, Chairman. I'm sort of disconnected. What is the capacity of the Wolf Hill Middle?
Just under 19,000
cubic metres. Okay. And just lastly, from the survey that was done the last time round, it flagged it up as a high risk, is that right?
No, we're basing that on the classifications that are being suggested for this bill.
Yeah. But as you observe and witness the operations, would you regard it as a high risk?
If you're using the fact that it's so many residential houses around it.
Yes, it's purely that. We would be.
Proximity of the housing is the danger signal for you.
Yeah.
We would see, we don't believe that's the case, but we would
But that's-
welcome
yeah.
surveys. The idea of doing regular surveys, yes, we would welcome that. That seems sensible to us.
Okay, John, thanks.
Okay, again, Damien and Jim, thank you very much for your time here today. It's been very, very informative and very, very useful for us as a committee. I hope you've found it of some use. And thank you very much for adding into our evidence on this reservoirs belt. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, members, moving on then, agenda item number 6 is the Reservoirs Bill oral briefing from the Institution of Civil Engineers. Can I refer members again to the memo from the target, pages 35 to 36? Potential topics to explore, pages 37 to 39, and the briefing papers from the Institution of Civil Engineers at pages 40 to 44. Can I ask members to seek to ensure that as many of the issues as possible are covered? As we'd already discussed, you have a list still in case I fell in. Can I welcome to the committee Alan Cooper, Jack Meldrum, David McKell and Stephen Orr. Gentlemen, you're very welcome to the committee here. Thank you very much for attending. Members will already have had an opportunity to read your briefing papers, so if I can ask you to take no more than 10 minutes. I know there's 4 of you, but about 10 minutes if that's possible, and then the committee will go straight into questions, if that's okay. I don't know who's leading off. Okay, Alan, without further ado, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairperson. The Institution of Civil Engineers, as an institution, we welcome the opportunity to discuss the bill with the committee, and we thank you for your invitation to see us. My name is Alan Cooper, and my colleagues are Jack Meldrum on my left, David McKill on my right, and Stephen Orr on my extreme left. Jack, David and I are all experienced panel engineers in terms of the Reservoirs Act as it applies in England and Wales. The Reservoirs Act 1975. And Stephen is in the process of training to become a supervising engineer as a panel engineer. David, Stephen and I represent a committee of the Institution of Civil Engineers in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland region of Civils, and we have provided a technical advisory role to DARD regarding the guiding principles of the Reservoirs Bill. Jack and I are both all reservoirs panel engineers, but Jack is here specifically to represent the institution's Reservoirs Committee in London, and he will inform us later, halfway through my talk, about the function of the Reservoirs Committee and the mechanisms later in our presentation. Before we start, could I say that flooding arising from the uncontrolled release of water from storage is entirely different from flooding from rivers and surface water following heavy rainfall. Totally different, because the failure of reservoir structures produces fast-flowing, deep water, which, as history tells us, has claimed lives and damaged livelihoods. The institution, as a professional body with many members engaged in design, operation and the maintenance of reservoirs, and so we're acutely aware of the need for vigilance in order to protect life and property from undue risk from the failure of dams. I and my colleague Jack will give a brief statement on behalf of the Civils Institution, following which we'll be pleased to answer any questions you might have. First of all, the reasons for the bill. We support the introduction of the bill to establish the legal and administrative frameworks for regulating reservoir safety in order to reduce the risk of flooding as a result of failure. It's estimated at the latest count that there are approximately 150 impoundments which will come within the scope of the Reservoirs Bill. Now, public reservoirs in Northern Ireland have been managed by the statutory authorities notably Northern Ireland Water, who are the largest owners of reservoirs in Northern Ireland. And they have generally followed the provisions of the Reservoirs Act 1975, which is applicable, as I said at the start, in England and Wales as best practice, even though the Act does not apply in Northern Ireland. The institution is strongly supportive of the introduction of specific legislation for the safety of reservoirs in Northern Ireland. However, owners of private reservoirs have no obligation to follow the 1975 Act. The introduction of the bill will ensure public safety assurance to all reservoirs of 10,000 cubic metres capacity and above. The institution supports the adoption of this threshold of 10,000. Until this reduction from 25,000, there has been concern for some time within the profession that 25,000 cubic metres threshold was based on outdated understanding of the current risks to reservoir safety. The 25,000 capacity corresponds to reservoirs of at least the size which were responsible for the fatal incidents in the 1920s in North Wales and in Scotland. There have been a number of incidents at smaller reservoirs in recent years where there was a potential for loss of life, and the figure of 10,000 metres capacity was therefore concluded to be the right figure for assessing risks to the public from reservoir failure. However, the institution is pleased to note that the safety records of reservoirs in Northern Ireland has been good, with no fatalities reported, even though some reservoirs have failed, and some quite recently. However, we believe that we cannot be complacent, and since many of the reservoirs are in excess of 100 years old, a well-structured and enforceable bill will provide assurance to the public for the safety of the public. We support the bill's assertion that the inspection and supervision regime of all high and medium risk reservoirs requires qualified civil engineers, and they are referred to as panel engineers, to carry out inspections and to make recommendations. This is the only suitable means of managing the risk of failure. We would, however, recommend that even low-risk reservoirs should have some regular form of inspection rather than relying on change of downstream conditions being identified by planning processes or the review by the enforcement authority. There will be financial implications. We've just heard from the meeting ahead of us. Financial implications arising from regulation, and these will cause concerns, especially amongst owners, many of whom have limited resources to meet the requirements. Existing impoundments contribute to the environment in terms of habitat, flood alleviation and amenity use to the overall benefit of society at large. Consequently, it's important that the costs associated with regulation do not result in owners modifying their reservoirs to remove their capability of holding water completely or below the threshold, in order to avoid the financial burden of routine maintenance and inspection. So at this stage, I'll hand over to Jack, who will explain the process for panel appointments and inspections and, in fact, the general working of the bill in GB.
Thank you. As mentioned by my colleague Alan Cooper, I am an AR panel engineer and currently a member of the ICE Reservoirs Committee, whom I represent here. I've been a panel engineer since 1987. I will deal with the general workings of the Reservoirs Act first, that's the 1975 Act, and then explain the panel engineering system that services the Act, and then explain how engineers are appointed to the panels. The Reservoirs Act 1975, with changes currently enacted from the Floods and Water Management Act of 2010, provides a registration, surveillance, supervision and inspection system for large raised reservoirs. Prior to the latest changes, this covered all reservoirs that are capable of storing more than 25,000 cubic metres above the lowest surrounding ground level. The Floods and Water Management Act introduced a risk-based criteria for the requirement for continuing supervision and inspection of reservoirs and made provision to reduce the minimum size. The 2030 secondary legislation was brought in the risk-based criteria and is currently being introduced. We're going through a changeover phase at the moment. The register of all large raised reservoirs is kept by the Enforcement Authority, who are the Environment Agency. They keep details of the reservoirs and copies of all reports and certificates, monitor compliance and keep records of incidents. They also take action when non-compliance occurs, although this is normally managed by reminders. In relation to all new large raised reservoirs, the Act requires that the design and construction must be supervised by a construction engineer. This engineer will issue certificates that permit impounding and also provide a certificate that provides a record of the design and construction. After 3 years, and providing he is satisfied that the reservoir no longer requires his supervision, the construction engineer's responsibility ends. The reservoir then comes under a supervising engineer, and this will be the same case for old existing reservoirs that haven't been caught up in the Act before. They would come in at this point and come under a supervising engineer. The supervising engineer appointment is a continuous appointment. The supervising engineer would typically visit a reservoir once or twice a year to check that no safety issues are arising, necessary maintenance is being carried out, to identify any further maintenance required, and that the reservoir undertaker is keeping the necessary records. The supervising engineer will provide an annual statement to the undertaker, advising him of any issues. This will also be copied to the Enforcement Authority so that they are aware of any safety or compliance issues. If the supervising engineer has concerns for the safety of the reservoir, he may call for an inspection. And when I'm talking about the reservoir undertaker here, I believe your terminology is reservoir safety manager. 2 years after a new reservoir is completed, and thereafter at intervals of normally 10 years, periodic inspections by an inspecting engineer are required. These inspections consider both the condition of the structure as well as review aspects such as the structure stability, spillway and scour capacity. If any shortcomings are identified by the inspecting engineer, he may require measures to be taken in the interest of safety, which the undertaker has to comply with. For recently built reservoirs, the likelihood of such measures may be expected to be low, but for older reservoirs, requirements are more common. Now I'll move on to the panel engineer system that we operate under. There are currently 4 panels under the 1975 Act. All reservoirs, non-impounding reservoirs, and by non-impounding I mean reservoirs that are not on a river, these are off-stream. Service reservoirs and supervising engineers, those are the 4 panels. All reservoir panel engineers may carry out any of the duties required from panel engineers under the Act, including being the construction engineer and inspecting engineer that I've mentioned previously, whereas supervising engineers are responsible for providing continuity of reservoir safety. The members of the non-impounding reservoir and service reservoir panels have the same responsibility as the all reservoir panel engineers, but they are restricted in the type of reservoirs they may deal with as construction inspecting engineers. The current numbers on each panel are 39, 2, 4 and 141 respectively. The principal panels are the all reservoirs and the supervising engineers panels. The all reservoir, non-impounding reservoir and service reservoir panel members are generally senior members of the civil engineering profession and have significant experience in reservoir engineering. The supervising panel engineers generally are engineers who have experience in reservoir engineering, often in operation and maintenance or in assisting in the design and construction of reservoir works. Ideally, supervising engineers should be based in the same region as the reservoirs they supervise, so that they're more readily available to attend call-outs and also to minimise cost. Construction and inspecting engineers frequently work outside their own region. Construction, inspecting and supervising engineers are selected and engaged by the reservoir undertakers. In Great Britain, the names of the panel engineers, together with their addresses and contact details, are kept on a database available on the Environment Agency website. There are no fixed fees for the various duties of the panel engineers. Am I all right to continue?
No, I'm gonna, be careful, I'm gonna just stop, that's okay. I'm gonna stop you there, Jack, if I can. I note that we are reading off the presentation, and we have the presentation, and we all have read it. So the 10 minutes is up, so I will stop you there if that's okay. If you want to paraphrase at the end of the written presentation, or if any of the other colleagues want to step in for a few minutes, I'll give you that, if that's okay, or everybody's content to stop there. We will be asking questions, of course, which should glean out more information from you. But all members have. Please assume that all members have read the presentation, the written presentation that you've given us. We'll go straight into questions. Joe Byrne, Deputy Chairperson.
Yeah, Chairman, I welcome the presentation, and it's good to hear from such experts as civil engineers. The accusation is that this is a civil engineers charter, this reservoirs bill. And there's real concern among many in the vulnerable community sector who look after some impounded waterways that costs will be prohibitive and they will be put out of business. What's your answer to that charge?
Well, could I just say that owners of reservoirs have responsibilities as they stand. So that has to be faced.
Why, therefore, do we need the reservoirs bill if they do have obligations at the moment?
What I'm saying, they have responsibility in the sense that they are liable at the minute.
I think if I could add to that, there's, as Alan has said, there's a liability on the owners, but there's not an obligation to positively act to safeguard the community or safeguard public life. So if something did go wrong, there's a liability under law that they could be taken and prosecuted for it, but we still have dead people.
So we've been living in such dangerous times that we didn't realise it, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. You were certainly living under an unrecognised risk, perhaps, by those who were looking after the reservoirs. They realised the asset that they had, but perhaps did not fully understand the impact that the release of the water could have, and therefore the risk that they were also being responsible for. But what the legislation does is tries to regularise that and tries to take an approach which is in the interest of public safety downstream, tries to control that risk by identifying that to the owners and allowing them to take appropriate measures to put inspections, appropriate level of inspections in place to help manage that risk robustly.
Yes, I can see the perspective that you're taking, but I think that there is a fear that we're now using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Is there a question?
Well, if I could take that as effectively what bringing the legislation into Northern Ireland is bringing Northern Ireland to line with the rest of the UK.
Do you mean that because we haven't had a disaster, there's no need for caution?
I mean that engineers have been obviously observing these reservoirs before, and there have been surveys before done, including the one that we heard about earlier on, the Wolfhill Middle.
Yeah.
And nobody raised great alarm bells.
Well, that is not true.
That's incorrect, actually. The survey that was carried out on the 3 reservoirs that are held by the organisation that was presenting previously identified significant problems. 2 of the reservoirs have had those problems resolved by one particular landowner who has resolved the upper and the lower reservoir. The middle one has not gone through the same robust remedial exercise, and therefore there's a question remains over the middle one. But the other two have been
You
resolved.
saying the middle one is at the moment a risk to the public at large?
The middle one is an unknown quantity in that since the original inspection there has not been a further inspection of it by a qualified civil engineer.
In fact, I have written a letter saying the middle reservoir is a problem. That letter is on record.
And would that letter signify a warning signal to those people?
It should have done.
It should have, yes.
Okay. How many reservoirs should a supervising engineer look after? And is it reasonable for a supervising engineer to be responsible for a reservoir here to reside in England?
I'll ask David to
Uh,
deal with that.
As a supervising engineer, I currently look after a couple of reservoirs in England. The reason that mechanism works is that they are a particular type of reservoir, and I have a client who understands the operation that I'm carrying out here in terms of maintaining the safety of the reservoirs. He carries out inspections and he reports that it is not necessarily a difficulty to have a remote person because it can work. In terms of the numbers of reservoirs, that depends on the proximity of them and whether they're all individual clients or different clients. For instance, in the Wolfville situation, the fact that the 3 reservoirs are adjacent to each other means that you're most likely to do an inspection of those together, which actually provides cost efficiencies to the particular reservoir owner, the manager, and therefore you can do those along with a number. It'd be quite reasonable to be looking after 15 or 20 reservoirs in that context, bearing in mind you're inspecting it once a year.
Given that you as an institute obviously are now over the complexities and the issues associated with the implications of bringing in a reservoirs bill, have you done an audit yet of the existing reservoirs across Northern Ireland as an institution? Or as an institute?
No, we haven't. That has.
So it's observational survey so far.
The Rivers Agency have carried out an exercise over the entire portfolio, as I understand it, of reservoirs that could come within the Act.
And would you guys have...
As an institution, we have not done that.
And would you guys have had sight of that survey report?
No. The full details of the reservoir inundation mapping and drawing up the database, that, as I understand it at the moment, is not in the public domain, totally in the public domain. But as an institution, we have not access to that information.
But would it be reasonable to assume that maybe, given the critical role that you guys as professionals will have to have in relation to surveys, that the Rivers Agency should provide that report to you as an institute?
If we as individuals, as an institution, we have no responsibility as an institution for reservoirs. But if us as individuals are asked to inspect a reservoir, it would be reasonable for us to approach the Rivers Agency and to ask for a copy of the flood map for that particular reservoir. And that will probably be forthcoming.
The reason I asked the question is because you have stated very clearly here that you welcome the reservoirs bill, and I'm wondering why you're so welcoming of it if you haven't a full report of the survey.
Well, the answer to that would be because it actually regularises and provides some framework to actually manage in a consistent way the risks associated with reservoirs. Up until the current position where this legislation was being brought forward, it was left to the professional and robust approach of the individual reservoir owners to deal with the safety and risks of their particular reservoir, such that they minimise the downstream risks to the population and industry and environment downstream of the actual reservoir. This legislation regularises that and provides a consistent approach to it.
So finally, are you saying that you're welcoming of this reservoirs bill because you feel that there are so many owners out there that don't realise the risk that they're in charge of or the liability consequential of any accident.
It probably would be fair to say that what the legislation does is it provides a support and reinforcement to any such reports and recommendations that are being made. Up until the current position, as I said, making any such reports and recommendations to any reservoir owner did not have to be carried out, and in some cases have not been carried out. And that's because there is no enforcement of legislative behind the actual report that's being provided to a particular reservoir owner.
Basically, we see it as a preventative measure.
Just on this now.
Yep.
Is the implication of that some reservoir owners have been irresponsible in not having these surveys done?
Certainly it is apparent. When reports are done, reports are left to the individual owners to actually deal with. And in many cases it's done, other cases it's not done as robustly as it should be.
Thanks, John.
Okay, Joe, thank you. Can I ask, David, something you brought out, came out in Joe's questioning, and you talked about the 3 reservoirs collectively at Wolf Hill. They could well be owned by various people. You did mention that there'd be a cost savings to review all 3 of those reservoirs at one time.
Yeah.
How would that ever be itimised if there were 3 separate owners?
There's nothing to stop owners actually coming together as combined bodies and actually saying, right, okay, even in terms, if you don't look at Wolf Hill, for instance, if you look at other fishing clubs and things, there's nothing to stop Ulster Anglers or whoever saying, we have X number of reservoirs here and we want someone to carry out the supervising function on this, and they actually then get a quote from supervising engineers to actually carry out that function. Absolutely nothing in a commercial environment to stop that taking place.
So then that, because I can understand
Yes.
I can understand the scale and the cost effectiveness of doing 3 at the same time, all
as opposed to one. Yeah.
But that would basically be one overall bill then, which then
they then distribute out. Yeah.
Distribute out between the 3 or 4 of the owners.
Yes, that's right.
How many there is. Right.
That's
okay. Right. With regards to the availability of engineers. Again, I know you teased this with regard to your presentation, but how many engineers like yourselves of your ilk are in the GB or the UK, and then how many of them are actually in Northern Ireland? Because it's something that came out last week that there's very little in Northern Ireland.
Well, in terms of as Jack has said, there are different levels of panel engineers. There are, if I'm wrong here, Jack, but I think there are 39 AR panel engineers. I'm the only one in Ireland currently. There are about 300 supervising engineers.
141, of which one is in Northern Ireland.
Would those engineers that are based in GB, England, Scotland, Wales, would they be willing and able to work in Northern Ireland?
May I answer that one?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I wouldn't see a problem, but as I said in my talk, I would see the supervising engineers as coming largely from Northern Ireland. They may not be there to begin with, but I would see that the Northern Ireland consultancies would pick up the task and get their engineers trained. And in my opinion, you are probably needing a pool of about 10 people who are trained as supervising engineers to cover the 150 reservoirs. Now, the maximum might be 20 to 30 on one individual engineer, but there will be engineers coming onto the list at the young end, and then there'll be those who are retiring at the other end and probably shedding the number of reservoirs that they do. So those are the sort of numbers you're talking about. So the supervising engineers, I would see, really ought to be something that the ICE, certainly from Northern Ireland, targets trying to service. The inspecting engineers, construction engineers, the AR panel engineers is a more difficult one. There is one at the moment. There is no reason why there shouldn't be more in the future. as the supervising engineers, the good ones, move on and become competent enough to become AR panel engineers. But I would expect, certainly for a decade or so, you would see some servicing from the from the mainland, from England, from Scotland, where there's also a number. And it's in the same way. I just give you by example. We still do a lot of work in Hong Kong, and it's AR panel engineers who are required for their reservoirs. So panel engineers are willing to travel.
Okay. How much of an increase, percentage-wise, did the work increase in England due to this legislation?
In terms of when we brought in the 1975 Act, that was the large increase, and there was a large number of the supervising engineers were not required before that time, and that was the major change, and that brought in a lot more work under the supervision phase. And generally, I would say, in terms of the AR panel work, the higher level, there has been an increase. It's due to a number of reasons. Awareness of what some of the problems are. As you find one failure mechanism or one situation, you then look at your other reservoirs in the same way. There's been an updating of understanding of floods, so that's brought in more work. Public acceptance of difficult situations is less. The big utility companies, more corporate responsibility and not wishing to have problems on their patch, those sort of things all influence the amount of work. So there has been an increase from that side. But I would say at the moment it's sort of stabilised. The next thing that's going to happen is that we are seeing the risk base, which is something that you've are adopting to begin with, and we will see a decline in the amount of supervision work from that, because we have a large number of small, low-risk reservoirs, which I expect to fall out from the supervision stage. If we drop down to the 10,000, which is what is being talked about, we will see a few increases from that.
Do you have any sort of thinking on how many? 25,000 down to 10? Is it going to double the reservoirs?
It's difficult to tell. The reason it's difficult to tell, because I think there's a degree of conservatism to start with in the enforcement authorities, the environment agencies' approach to deregulation of putting reservoirs as low risk. I think it'll take 2 or 3 years at least, I think, for this to unwind and for us to really find out. But early figures that I've heard is that we may be losing a quarter of the reservoirs.
Okay. Is there an issue? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to add just to help inform you in terms of numbers of engineers in the process. I suppose to some degree the reason why there's one AR and one supervising is because of particular business reasons, personal business reasons, in terms of the organisations that we work within, who have had an interest in reservoir design work and development work throughout the islands, Southern Ireland and across in other areas of Europe. And that is, in order to be a panel engineer, you also, I referred to previously about looking after a couple of reservoirs, you need to be looking after some reservoirs from a supervising point of view, in the GB legislation to be a panel engineer. So historically, that's why I've looked after some. I am equally aware that Stephen's one example, and there are a number of others who are in training, and some that I know have applications prepared, which would assist in increasing the number of supervising engineers. So I wouldn't be as concerned, and particularly the other aspect is, I'm not sure what the discussions that you had with Northern Ireland Water, but they certainly would have quite a number of engineers who are involved with ongoing inspection work, who are likely or may, depending on the commercial decision that Northern Ireland Water take, as to whether they will formally have their trained people go through the panel appointment process or whether they will outsource it. That's a debate for them, but they certainly would have a number of individuals who could go through that process.
If this legislation was to come into force, that qualification whereby you have to be looking after reservoirs in England, that would change?
I'm presuming would change, and therefore the looking after reservoirs here would allow you them by default to be a panel engineer, which otherwise you wouldn't have been able to be.
Right, okay. One question I will ask, is there any concern with regards to age profile of panel engineer?
I'm sort of, I'll answer that because he keeps asking me when I'm putting my panel AR appointment in. I've been at reservoirs for 30 years in terms of this, but I'm at a stage where I should be putting in my all reservoirs panel application. So that is the sort of, I'm not saying what age I am.
I would say that as an institution, we are concerned that the average age of the supervising engineers is higher than it should be. We would like it to be much lower.
And the engineers who look after, supervise, and the panel engineers who look after reservoirs, they only look after reservoirs. You don't go build bridges around the gap.
No, there would be very few supervising engineers who would do nothing else but supervise. In fact, that is not a healthy situation. We would not like to encourage a situation where supervising engineers do nothing else. And Jack, you would agree?
Absolutely endorse it, because you need people to have a good broad-based understanding of the engineering aspects that are involved with reservoirs. It probably takes, for example, up no more than 20% of my time.
Right. Okay. Looking after the reservoirs.
Reservoirs in GB.
Okay. You want on that?
Just a very quick one on that. If engineers are only dedicated to looking after reservoirs and they seem to be governed by yourselves, who sets the fee for an inspection?
There is. John?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
There is no fixed fee. It's fee competition. Different clients have different approaches to it. Different engineers have different approaches to it. It depends on the amount of work that's involved, the complexity of the reservoir, and what exactly, with some clients, what exactly the client is expecting. Some clients are far more proactive and actively involved and want to know and want to review, want to discuss. Others are not so.
I'll give you another example in terms of things that will influence the actual cost of that. What has been done on some occasions is that the staff of the particular reservoir, the owner, they will take an interest and be involved with keeping an eye on the reservoir, and will work with the supervising engineer such that he requires less input to the overall process, such that he goes and he talks to the individuals, he reviews what they've been looking at, any concerns that they've had, and then he writes his report. If it's left totally that the supervising engineer has to keep an eye on the reservoir and he's responsible at all times, then he's going to have to look at it more frequently, he's going to have to keep an eye on it, and he'll spend more time. Whereas if there's a collaborative approach by the reservoir owner, then that particular supervising engineer can take a different view on cost. The other thing that influences cost is if he has a period to his appointment. If he's doing, I'm only appointing you for 1 year, and then I'm going to go out to competition, somebody else has to do it for another year. The difficulty with that is that if you're doing it on a consistent basis, there is an understanding that is gained of a particular reservoir, how it works, how it performs, and it makes it easier and more cost efficient to look after a reservoir. If you're coming into a new reservoir every time and you have to research the background, you have to understand everything that's going on, that adds cost and means that a one-off inspection for looking after for 1 year is a more expensive inspection than if you're looking after it for a 3-year period or a 5-year period.
So for a number of the private individuals that I suppose, Chair, we've had in front of the committee are, I suppose, scared of what their initial fee is going to be, and a lot of them are very ignorant or unaware of what will be involved in the legislation. So I can see a lot of reservoir owners, managers coming to yourselves and going, how much is this going to cost me? For minimum input from them because they're unaware of what their responsibility is, what would your ballpark figure be?
I mean, the interesting thing is that historically we've sat down with. You've had Glenone Fisheries, people like that from Derry and other organisations? No, various ones. We sat down with. We have in the past sat down with a number. You sort of diverting between ICE and normal work here. You've sat down with a number of them and you've gone through and you've explained what we would like to do is to give them an understanding of what's involved here. It's better for a reservoir owner to understand what you're doing. We would always prefer that that's a process, and that's what we would. I would certainly try to do whenever I'm working with a client on a reservoir supervision project.
Sorry, I know you asked my party colleague earlier on, or Joe, my committee colleague, was there a question there? My question actually was, right. David, what is your ballpark figure for somebody coming to you for the first time?
Coming to a first time, it's difficult to sort of say, depending on whether it's a Ben Crum or whether it's one of Wolf Hill ones. They're different kettles of fish.
So say, for example,
supervising
Wolf Hill Middle, say for an example.
Wolf Hill Middle, Wolf Hill Middle isn't going to cost you any more than £1,000 for supervision work.
And that would be for a one-off for 3 years.
You might come and have a look at it for a couple of occasions on that. Look at it twice and sit down and talk to them and write a report on it in terms of the conditions.
Could I say, in terms of funding, a far bigger issue is the cost of repairing these dams, bring them up to the standard that the public reservoirs have. That for this committee, this is a far bigger issue, because some of these dams could very well have well in excess of that sort of money, tens of thousands, to bring them up, to bring their overflows, whatever, to bring them up to standard. So that is an issue. Funding, we see as a committee, and we have talked about this in committee, that the funding of not just inspections but repairs is a serious issue to avoid a lot of these being taken out of service, abandoned, which would be a great pity.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Tommy Cannon and then Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Do you have an agreed method of assessing the likelihood of a reservoir?
This is a big issue. This legislation we're talking about is purely a process. There's nothing in this legislation to talk about how you make dams safe. So in terms of an engineer approaching a dam, depending on the type of dam, is it a concrete dam, is it an earth dam, there are various modes of failure. That is a big issue. But the All Reservoirs Panel engineer, his appointment is a personal appointment. It is not an appointment of his firm. These are personal appointments. The panel engineer takes personal responsibility for what he reports, and it is his opinion. There are lots of guidelines in the industry, professional and otherwise, but basically the panel engineer will make his personal recommendation as to how safe that reservoir is against various modes of failure, and there are many. But there isn't time today to go into all of that. But it is very technical.
Yeah, but what you're really telling committee is that any mitigating circumstances to deem a reservoir safe in the eyes of an engineer, or any recommendations put forward, is based on that recommendation's own opinion.
It is the opinion of the panel engineer who, for an existing reservoir, he carries out, under the 75 Act, he carries out what is known as a Section 10 report, and he will look at all aspects of that reservoir. He will do a very thorough examination of the records, everything that is available. He will ask for the previous reports. He will ask for the supervising engineer's statements, all the monitoring, anything that is available. He will go through all of that, and before he signs off his report, which is a very serious report, he will go through all of that. When he finishes his report, that report, he is finished. That's his job done. The supervising engineer's role goes on and on. over the period of his appointment. The Section 10 report is complete when he signs it and submits it, unless he's given further instructions to do other work.
Yeah, but there's no agreed method of assessing a likelihood of a failure of a reservoir, so therefore there could be added cost put on to an individual who has a reservoir, or someone comes out and looks at it and determines, right, you need X amount of work done, but that's based on his opinion. It's not based on any method that's set out as to how you assess the likelihood of a failure.
There are lots of guidelines. Are you saying that if the owner wants a second opinion, he should get a second opinion? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm just asking what method there is for assessing it from an engineer's point of view, because you're the professionals.
Yes.
You're the boys that's going to be getting paid for going out to do this particular issue. So therefore, the question has been put to you: what type of mechanism have you got of assessing a likelihood of a failure?
Well, there are so many aspects to be looked at. If you want to take an example, the overflow. There are general guidelines about the design of a spillway, which are universal across and are accepted. The panel engineer has to keep himself up to date, fully up to date with current affairs and within the expertise within the industry. But it's a big subject. There are so many modes of failure.
Okay, fair enough. We'll leave that at the moment. If a reservoir manager implements a recommendation or a repair or maintenance programme as set out by an engineer to make that reservoir safe, one would then understand that would greatly reduce the risk of failure and should leave that reservoir then subject to a lower level of regulation with regards to inspection, maintenance and repair. Can you advise what would in a case like that, what would be that lower level of risk?
Well, you have to be very careful talking about risk. Risk is a combination of likelihood of failure and the consequence of that failure. Are you talking about the likelihood of failure?
Yeah.
The likelihood. Yeah. Well, the Section 10 report will make recommendations. When those are carried out, they will then be signed off. And the panel engineer will sign them off only if they are carried out to his satisfaction. But they are you are right, they are in the opinion of that panel engineer that this is what, in his opinion, needs to be done.
And if all that work is carried out, does that reduce the risk of
It reduces the likelihood of failure.
It doesn't change the risk category.
It doesn't change the risk category, but it reduces the likelihood.
Yeah.
Can I just explain that the risk category is dependent on what the consequence of the failure is? So if there's 100 houses downstream, the only way you will change the risk category is to remove the houses.
Right. If that work is all carried out, then that reduces the amount of inspections, maintenance and repair and that type of stuff. Is that right?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
There can be differences here. I mean, you've hit on a pretty good point here, is that if you can tackle problems in different ways, if something is seen as a problem, in certain cases, increasing the surveillance is a way of managing the risk of it failing. So if you are looking at it on a daily basis, for example, to see if anything is going wrong, that's one way of managing something that you think could happen. You've got the signs of something is going on. Let's take an example. The embankment is leaking. Leaks, in the long term, potentially lead to failure. But if somebody is watching how that leak is progressing, and if the leak is not changing, so you're monitoring it more carefully, you can carry on in that monitoring phase for longer. If you didn't have that assurance of that monitoring being carried out, you would have to do something preventative sooner. Have I explained myself?
Yeah, but you know, really and truly, if an engineer comes out and looks at a reservoir and makes a recommendation that certain works needs to be done to make this reservoir safe, and that works is then done, surely that should reduce the number of inspections and maintenance and repair that has to be carried out that reservoir. Or if it doesn't, the recommendation that was put forward in the first place wasn't correct.
A stitch in time, absolutely. If thing is fixed early, the better. We all agree with that. It's the hole in your roof. If you have a tile missing, you want to get it fixed pretty quickly, don't you? So a stitch in time. But surveillance, improved surveillance is fine. It will not necessarily stop the dam failing, but it's worth doing.
If you want to look at it from two different aspects, in that report there could be some things which are the fact that the reservoir doesn't comply with standards, and there could be other things. In other words, as Alan says, if the spillway doesn't have enough capacity, and you have to change the spillway in order to provide enough capacity. Now, those are one type of recommendations. There are other recommendations which can be much more immediate, and such as this leak and requiring further monitoring. So, for instance, to resolve each of those, if you carry out more monitoring to keep an eye on the leak, that's one way of managing it, or fix the leak. Once you've done all of these things, it's likely that you'd have to do more regular monitoring until you've resolved all of those. Once you've got all of those things resolved, you go back to the default position, which is you do a 10-yearly inspection and you supervise it on a twice-yearly basis. That's the default once you've got a reservoir into a satisfactory condition in terms of meeting standards and not having a lot of urgent inspection monitoring work that needs to be carried out. The default is what's set out, the biannually and the 10-yearly inspection.
May I possibly add something to that, if possible? I think the legislation is very well designed in the respect that it is taking a risk-based approach. The problem with the risk-based approach at the moment is there's no universally worldwide accepted standard of, as you say, assessing the likelihood of a dam failing. But the legislation as it stands is beneficial on the basis that you won't have to come back and reenact primary legislation whenever a universally accepted risk-based approach becomes accepted right across the world in respect of dams. Then you can invoke that through secondary legislation. So at the moment your legislation is drafted on the basis that it is risk-based, but it's risk-based on the consequence, i.e. if it fails. And I do accept your points. If you carry out works, and I think David's tried to outline it, that you will benefit in the basis that your inspections will be a bit cheaper because you'll not be looking at the things in as much detail. However, it doesn't reduce the number of inspections you have to do. It won't take you from a high risk to a medium risk as the legislation currently stands, because the worldwide acceptance is that you cannot say around likelihood of failure, and you know that is certainly research across the world at the moment, and the legislation as it stands will permit that to come in at such times whenever it's accepted. If that hopefully helps you.
So once the high risk, always a high risk.
Until at this moment in time, the risk is based on consequence, and as I say, number of houses downstream. Mm-hmm. If in future, and the work is ongoing to understand the balance of number of houses versus a very good, well-maintained, brand-new dam that has low risk of failure, then once that knowledge and whatever becomes standard worldwide practice, then it will be enacted, I believe, in Northern Ireland, but at the moment it's not standard practice. The other thing, maybe if I could add on that, is that dams do fail quite rapidly, and I appreciate it's 150 years ago now, but Dale Dyke in Yorkshire failed at 5 o'clock in the evening. Somebody noticed leaks starting to come through the dam, and at 2 o'clock in the morning the entire thing failed and people were dead. The risk, and I think if you go back to Ully back in the late 2000 noughties, effectively 27, 28, it occurred through high rainfall, etc., and it overtopped. The spillway was inadequate, and it caused the M1 in England to be shut. In England, they do not shut motorways. It was in risking of the main gas main, north-south gas main. It occurred rapidly, It didn't occur. It wasn't something you saw coming on, and for weeks in advance. It was something that occurred, fairly rapidly. And I've seen the pictures of the fire service trying to pump down the dam, and all the sluices were open, and photographs of a big scar hole on the front slope and the dam being risked. Things unfortunately do happen.
But that begs the question: why didn't the supervisor engineer pick that up?
That is a very good question, and probably is maybe the subject of litigation.
And the whole kernel of the point here is that you're basing risk on, if I may add, a false premise. Because no matter what society you're in, no matter what job you're in, everyone has to risk manage.
Yes.
But what you're doing is not managing risk.
Yes.
With regards to that, the example you give, and I take the point that flooding is completely different from rain levels rising or what river levels rising. And it's a surge or a tsunami, if you like, for a better way of describing it. But you cannot really tell us that if you recommend that there has to be £10,000 worth of repairs on a dam wall, or in fact you recommend the Hoover Dam in an instance, that cannot and will not change the risk. Because it has to be, the risk must be, surely, the impact and the probability.
That's right.
We would concur with that, and your legislation is drafted in that respect. But as we, the institution, said at the moment, we do not believe there's an internationally recognised approach. And if you were to adopt something here in Northern Ireland, that would have to be based on something that is developed, presumably by Rivers Agency, that is not based on maybe research or knowledge elsewhere in the world.
It is very important to distinguish between likelihood and consequence. The likelihood of failure of a dam can change very quickly. A spillway could block, a tree could come down and block a spillway. It has changed in a half an hour. It has changed the likelihood of that dam being overtopped and people being killed. I mean, it's as stark as that. But just very basically, the dams that we're most concerned about in Northern Ireland are the privately owned dams, which are largely embankment dams. An embankment dam is made up of three main features. There's the retaining bank itself, there's the overflow. If you imagine just your bath, there's the retaining structure, there's the overflow, and there's the plug to let water out. Once you have improved the spillway to the standard for the downstream consequence, that should be at finished in terms of, provided that spillway is kept clear. If it's sized for the right downstream consequence, you're then talking about any deterioration in the embankment or deterioration in the draw-off works. And they do deteriorate with time. And they do need to be maintained. And that is the reality. But those are the three big features in an earthen embankment. And once a dam is kept up, brought up to a good standard, which I personally did with a colleague to all the publicly owned water supply reservoirs, 60 of them in Northern Ireland. Once they were brought up to that standard in the 70s, they have been maintained by Water Service extremely well. And we would say as well as anywhere in the world, actually. But the privately owned reservoirs, a lot of them have had nothing, absolutely nothing, in the last 40, 50 years. And that has to be a concern for this committee.
But the point I'm trying to get at, and Tom was trying to get at, was the actual, if you were to supervise, and then, okay, you see a wee leak, so you supervise more, and I take it you'll be doing the surveillance, which will incur more cost.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, no. I'm not required to do the surveillance at the current situation. I can provide advice to a particular owner. You need to keep an eye, but there's no legislative requirement for any reservoir owner to have me involved with looking at that supervision. It can be carried out by them until such time as the legislation requires it carried out by a qualified civil engineer.
But if you then produce a report which recommends so much investment, which then is done, no matter what type of dam it is, or reservoir, and that work is done, and then you're still coming out 2 times a year to inspect something that's probably up to a standard which is state of the art.
Yeah.
is that not just a waste of time and a waste of resource? Because you know in all probability that in the likelihood that that dam will not breach or fail, and if it does, it will fail within hours. So a 2 yearly inspect, or a year by 2 inspections per year might not catch that on. So either we're saying that the 2 6-month inspections is appropriate, or am I hearing that it may never be appropriate, that we might never catch a breach and a breach might happen within hours? Which basically leaves this reservoir bill redundant, really.
I would explain that by going back to the fact that in the normal process, this attendance biannually is in conjunction with discussions with the reservoir operator, the reservoir manager's staff. It's not that you do the only level of keeping an eye on things. What would be expected is that the owner has an understanding. It's what I mentioned to your colleague here about trying to gain an understanding within the owner's organisation of what we're actually looking at here, understand how the reservoir performs, have them involved with that process. And then what you're doing on the biannual inspections is you're discussing that operation. It's not that it needs to be an onerous task to them. I mean, fishing clubs out, you've got fishing people out round all the time. You know, if they have in the back of their head that, oh yes, there's a damp piece here, I'll refer to such and such, and then they can raise it with, they can be involved with the whole process to keep it down to that minimum. And it's by managing it in that collaborative approach that it allows you to have that level of inspection.
Yeah, but you're still having an involvement which puts a burden on the reservoir owner, no matter if they're NI Water, whether they're the local fishing club or angling club, or whether they're the local environment agency or environment association. They're still got a burden now every year of maybe what could be £4,000, which could be a yearly bill, which then would be a burden on them, which could well put them under.
Sorry, the £4,000, where would that come?
£4,000, and that would be for the 2 inspections per year, and then any work. Would that be? Would you dispute that?
Yeah, you're talking about that's a combination of inspection and maintenance work.
Yes,
that's right. I'm not clear on the cost of the maintenance work for them, but
yes, it's just I've got information here that Mackey's Dam in Belfast, the 2010-2011, the cost for a supervising engineer was £4,000. In 2013-14, the cost of the inspecting engineer was £5,000. Maintenance work over the last 5 years has been £24,500.
I would not have thought that the inspection work would have been that value. Certainly in one of the years there is a section 10 and a section 12 in that, probably.
What do you mean by section 10, section 12?
Sorry, a 10 yearly inspection as well as a section 12, so it's happened. They're saying that's not. That couldn't be right.
Again,
without, I would need to see the detail of that, but that's
that
strange.
In DSD, but we will have to get that
strange, right? Okay.
Okay. And if you can give us any supporting evidence.
Certainly, I would suggest that the figure I mentioned is a fairly typical local figure for that sort of service.
Sorry, you said 1,000?
Yes.
Per year?
Per year.
Or for 2 inspections?
For 2 inspections. Yeah.
It's £500 per inspection.
£500 per inspection.
Could I possibly add to that, Chairman, on the respective? Now, it's a large raised dam that I have been to in Scotland, owned by Scottish and Southern Energy, concrete dam, and since the day on it was constructed, it does have leaks, and it does have, between the concrete sections, there's bitumen sealant, and it's the bitumen sealant is squeezing through over time. And I was kindly taken by the Scottish and Southern Energy and their particular supervisor. He goes twice a year, and he has a team of people. Now, in fairness, he has a team of people. They have 90 reservoirs looking at it, but he goes twice a year, and the things he's looking for is the leak still continuing? So I think even with spending capital money on a dam, even an earth bank dam, it will continue to leak. Dams do leak, and it's the regular supervision is just keeping that safety eye on it and ensuring that things aren't changing that would raise alarms. And the fact that this gentleman from Scottish and Southern goes every 6 months, and he can tell you, well, in the winter it doesn't, the bitumen doesn't seep through just as much because it's cold, and in the summer it does. And having that sort of knowledge, where if someone new turned up, they would see maybe the water coming through, leaking through dams and the stalactites hanging, and would panic at that. And it is about that long-term understanding of the dam to ensure and reassure the owner that they don't actually have a problem. So it's about keeping a regular eye on it for that safety reason.
Okay, Ian Mallon.
Thank you, Chair. A lot of the questions that I was going to pose there have been already covered by different members, but I just want to follow up. You see the average cost is roughly around £1,000 for 2 super inspecting engineers visits every year. And what about the follow-up, the supervising engineer? How is that calculated, and how much would that cost?
Sorry, just for the sake of clarity, that sort of cost is a ballpark. We talked about middle for the supervising service for that sort of period of time. The inspecting engineer is a once every 10 years type role. Which,
and how much would that?
Well, probably it's fair to say it could be at that time £3,000 or £4,000 and that's once every 10 years.
On a 10-year period, you're talking about?
You're talking about £300, £400 a year
right.
If you're dividing it up over 3 years. Is that fair to say?
But it does depend on the scale. For a small reservoir, it could be much less than 2,000. It could be maybe 1,500 for a small reservoir.
Okay.
So it really depends on the scale.
And if you're able to group them together, if you take, a dam in West Tyrone, if someone's based in Belfast and has to go out to it, where you're doing 3, you can travel out once in a day.
Yeah.
And just to follow up on Thomas Buchanan's point there, that in a situation where somebody comes out and gives an opinion, an engineer comes out and gives an opinion, and he's involved in the panel, could another engineer come out, or another engineer have a different opinion, if you like, than the engineer that recommended whatever? Or are they reading from the same hymn sheet?
Well, I mean, there's pretty good consistency across the board. There is no British standard for dams. That's the first thing. There is no British standard saying, you just tick the boxes. So the Section 10 report by the All Reservoirs Panel Engineer is his personal opinion. It's a personal appointment from the Secretary of State, whoever, and his reputation stands by it. But the question of getting a second opinion arises. If he says this is a lot of rubbish, the legislation covers that.
He still has to pay for the second opinion.
Well, it very rarely happens. Jack, do you want to speak on that?
It very rarely happens, but you have an appeals process in your, within so many days, somebody can, object and ask for a second inspection, and then I've personally not known one that's gone through that route. I do believe it has happened, where somebody has a different opinion. By and large, the issues are seen fairly much in the same way by panel engineers. There is a degree of subjectivity to it. That's always going to be the case. We are individuals. We have our own opinions and our own thresholds of where we consider something is safe and not safe. To your colleagues who was going on about the quantitative approach, is there a quantitative approach? All these structures are individual, very difficult to be quantitative. You can look at a big portfolio of reservoirs and judge them on a portfolio basis, a quantitative basis, to prioritise when you spend your money and where you spend your money. Yes, you can do that, but it is difficult.
Yeah, and could I ask there, that from an engineer's point of view, why probability cannot be taken into account?
Why probability of failure? Well, we are moving down a direction of looking at a qualitative risk analysis. And the science of qualitative risk analysis is developing, put it that way. It's not an exact science. At the end of the day, really, it is largely the judgment of the engineer.
Even the quantitative one degree has got subjective judgments got to be made along the route of doing that quantitative assessment.
Yes.
To put it into very, very practical terms, if you're standing looking at a particular reservoir and this reservoir was built 100 years ago, and it is an embankment reservoir, and you're told, we've no record drawings, we understand it has clay in the core, but we're not sure what width. The difficulty very often in trying to come to some standard method is because the reservoirs are all so different. They've been there over such a long period of years, and you don't actually know. You can't tell by looking at the outside exactly what's in the inside, and therefore you don't know how wide is that, how much clay is actually in it. You'd have to do a whole lot of investigation. And even you did investigation, I'm sure you're probably aware people have done boreholes in some places, and then they found all sorts of other things in between the boreholes. So there's so much of a potential for variation that it makes coming up with a very standardised approach quite difficult to do.
And on that point then, so if you're quantifying how many cubic metres in a reservoir, for example,
Yes. Yeah.
so there's a certain amount of silt, there's a certain amount
Yes.
of solar, muck, whatever you call it,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
that, so you're basing your cubic metres on the actual water that's in the reservoir.
So
It's the volume that can escape.
yeah.
So, but how do you distinguish? How do you find out how much liquid, if you like, is in that reservoir?
Well, sometimes
And
there.
does an engineer? Is that the remit of an engineer?
Yeah, sometimes particular reservoir owners have a bathymetric survey. Some, who would, and therefore you're able to determine what it is. There are some records from previous original designs at times where there's what's called a height capacity curve. Sometimes there's information available, and aside from that, you can actually quantify by looking at the topography of a valley and the profile of that, and you can actually calculate what is likely to be in that. If you're not going to spend the money on doing a bathymetric, you can come to some geometric means of actually calculating what's in that and what might be released by that failure of an embankment. So there's different ways, and it depends on the information that's available from the particular reservoir owner.
But that calculation would not sit with the panel engineer. That would
No.
sit with the Rivers Agency as the enforcement authority.
Yeah.
Right. And well, I suppose then I'd need to ask the question to Rivers Agency. How do they come to that capacity? Well,
Yes.
okay. Right. Say a typical reservoir. What types of defects would you expect to find? I know you talked about the bath and the plug and the leak and the overflow and all of that. But
One very important feature in an earth dam is, or in fact any dam, but we're focusing here on these earth dams that are privately owned in Northern Ireland that have not been maintained. And one feature that is very critical is a means of emptying the reservoir quickly in case something happens. If I'm called out to a leak in a reservoir at 2 o'clock at night in the pitch dark and you go to the reservoir, the only thing you can do there and then, if it's safe to do so, is to open the scour valve and get the water level down. Because a reservoir that's empty is made safe. But that is the only on-site plan that you can have at 2 o'clock in the middle of the night when you have a torchlight and you're on your own or almost on your own. So that is a very, very important feature. I mentioned the overflow. The risk of overtopping an earth dam is a big, big risk. If the spillway is fixed for the appropriate downstream consequence, if it's fixed for the appropriate downstream consequence and it doesn't block, that spillway should not be a concern anymore. But the embankment itself and the draw-off facilities are a continuing concern because they can deteriorate.
If you're looking for specific risk issues, and you talk about the embankment that Alan's looking at, the upstream will have likely pitching on the upstream face to stop the wave action eating away into the embankment. Very often, if you walk along that, you'll find that the material between the pitching has been sucked out by the wave action, and what you can find very often is voids behind that pitching. You can find growths, trees and whatever along the crest, and the difficulty with that is sometimes if a tree gets to a particular size, it can fall over, can take a chunk of the embankment with it, and therefore there's a potential for release of water. Equally, the roots of the tree can go through the core. If there's supposed to be a clay core in the middle, the roots of that tree can go through. Even you cut it down the downstream side and the root decomposes, you then have a route for along the decomposed route for the water to actually seep out. So, there's quite a number of things, and there's all sorts of training sessions that can go on in terms of looking at those sort of issues, the potential things that can go wrong with reservoirs, and it's understanding how the dam is constructed, and that informs the type of defects that you'll get associated with that dam.
Of the 150 odd reservoirs that are here, are you concerned about the structures of any of them, and why?
Any that we have seen, we've dealt with. I have personally been to about 100 of Northern Ireland's reservoirs at some stage. I have been advising Northern Ireland Water since 1973 on their 48 reservoirs. Currently, they have about half of them out of service. They are all, I've reported on most of them. The ones that our firm were involved in building, the firm that I worked for at that time, building or raising, if we raised by more than 25,000 cubic metres, I have not reported on those under Section 10. I have asked someone else to report. Another firm that's to do with independence. But the situation is that the ones that I haven't seen, I can't comment on. There is one in particular that I do not want to mention. But I really would have to say that we do need legislation here. If you want to see what a breach looks like, I would suggest the committee asks David Porter to lift a gate at Toome and simulate a breach, and it would scare the life out of you. If you lift a gate, that is what a breach will look like, and the noise of it. And if one of our dams at, say, Woodburn, Carrickfergus, if one of those dams were to go, it would be appalling. I mean, the loss of life would be absolutely enormous. Now, I've lived with that, giving advice since '72, and the Northern Ireland dams are in terrific shape. But having said that, the Severn Valley nearly failed in the 70s. Very few people know about this, but just to go on from David's point about the revetment was undermined by material being washed out through the cracks, and the wall was about to go, the crest wall. And if that storm had gone on much longer, believe it or not, the Severn Valley would have been breached. I mean, it's staggering.
How was that repaired then? No, just really
the firm called Binnies, who were involved in the original. There was a big problem with the Severn Valley, as you know, the cut-off. But a chap from Binnies engineered a complete reconstruction of the revetment, and they rebuilt the entire revetment to make sure that didn't happen again. But that was a reservoir that was only built in the 30s.
Yep.
You know, a lot of the dams we're talking about go way, way back. For instance, Loch Island Reeve is 1839. You know, a very, very old reservoir when techniques were really quite primitive in the 1800s. But I mean, there's an example of a very well-built reservoir, Severn Valley, and it needed maintenance. But it was saved. It was saved.
Okay.
Can I ask on that, how was the potential failure identified?
It was identified in the storm where the revetment suddenly collapsed. What happened was the material was being sucked out from underneath the revetment, the big blocks of the big ashlar blocks, and the gravel from underneath was being washed out, and people were not aware of that, and it suddenly collapsed in a storm. And the crest wall, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Sound Valley, the crest wall was undermined. And had the storm gone on for much longer, there was a real risk of a breach. I mean, it is a bit scary, that.
That was prior to the Northern Water inspection.
That was at the very start. At the start, yeah. That was
really at the stage prior to Northern Water having instigated. I'm sure they've mentioned about the regime that they would have in place.
Yeah. That wouldn't happen now. The system we have with the Northern Ireland Water, there are inspections at different levels of personnel. There's a very important monthly inspection, and he checks, or she, against a whole lot of different features, and it's almost like a very thorough checklist, and it is signed off. That goes up the line. Then there are two other inspections, additional to that, and then there's the yearly inspection. So as you go up, more senior people, and then there's the 10-yearly inspection. Northern Ireland Water have been doing those carefully since '72.
Well, look, I just want to say thank you. I found it very interesting, your presentation and the conversation, so thanks, Chair.
Okay, William Mervyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have heard from a number of private sector owners, and some of them have been seriously considering decommissioning, abandoning or discontinuing the reservoir because of the erroneous duties this bill will impose on them. What are your thoughts on the decommissioning of a reservoir, and has this been done anywhere else in England or Scotland? Are you aware of that?
Yes, there is. It's actually covered by our legislation, and then there's two things you can do. One is abandon, and the other one is discontinue a reservoir. One is where you basically stop it being able to store water at all, and the other one is where you take it down below the threshold level. At the moment, it's 25,000 cubic metres, and that has to be certified by a panel engineer in England, Wales and Scotland. So the works have to be safe works, because you could do it in a way where somebody just drives a bulldozer through the bank, leaves it in a pretty unstable, unsafe state, and when you get a flood through the reservoir, it could start washing out more material, and you would have a large mess downstream. So, but there is experience, and it is done. And there are, I haven't got examples here, but there are a number of examples of where people have had it done. The other issues that occur with it are quite often planning and environmental issues are all associated with it.
Yeah. Okay. Can your institution train non-engineers to carry out the routine observation of a reservoir? And if so, what benefit does this to the supervising engineer? And could, for instance, a private sector owner or a manager be trained to carry out this work?
Don't start your order, me. If you're saying, can the ICE train to carry out this work, there is nothing to prevent any individual within a private sector or community group or whatever going through the training process and applying and being appointed to the supervising panel, provided they have the requisite experience. If they do that, they can carry out that role as a supervising engineer in the same right as any other supervising engineer would do. There's also a sort of as I've indicated in my earlier comments, that there's a sort of an intermediate where they can reduce the cost and input required by a trained supervising engineer by they themselves carrying out a lot of the ongoing keeping an eye on the reservoir and understanding, having a bit of training and understanding which helps them assist the formal supervising engineer in carrying out his annual statement. So yes, it's back to what I said, a collaborative approach is very much the best because it keeps a closer, more regular, ongoing eye on the reservoir, and people understand when issues do occur, if they do occur.
Yeah. I think some of the concerns, one of my concerns would be in the bigger picture is, while we are aware that you mentioned Silent Valley and there's a number of very large reservoirs that maybe, if they were breached, would be a major risk. So many of the private smaller reservoirs pose little or no risk, and there is concern among those owners that this could be very erroneous on them.
Well, could I stop you there? I'm sorry, but some of this is the interesting thing that has come out of Darge's work, that some of these smaller reservoirs have a very, very big consequence downstream. Now, this has come as a bit of a surprise to possibly to this committee, but you imagine a small reservoir sitting above Holywood, and there are two small ones, Church Road Upper and Lower. Obviously if the upper one goes, it'll take the lower one with it. But the loss of life in Holywood would be very high, because you're aware of the topography of Holywood. It's steep and it's a confined valley. And then it opens out through the town of Holywood. And a failure of the upper Church Road reservoir does not bear thinking about. I don't live in Holywood, but you're all familiar with how steep the Holywood Hill is above. That would roar down through, and it's some of these smaller reservoirs have a very, very high consequence. So it's not just the Woodburns and the Spellbirds and Silent Valleys by any means. Now, having said that, a big reservoir like Altnaheglish, which Banagher up at Dungiven, it sits up above Dungiven, but Dungiven's on a hill, and by the time that flood hits Limavady, again Limavady is sitting quite high. The actual fatalities from Altnaheglish, which is a very big reservoir, and I have had to stabilise that 30 years ago because it was going to lift off its foundations. It's a 40-metre high dam. It's the highest dam in Northern Ireland. It is a very big reservoir, but a failure of it would not kill as many people as a small reservoir in Holywood. Yeah. So be very, very careful. Don't think that because the reservoir is small, it depends on where it sits above the population. And some of these small ones, you would not want them to fail.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Ian, you want to come in?
I just want to ask, Chair, thank you for letting me back in here. Like the more I hear about reservoirs and all of that there, reservoirs provide a service then, what you're saying, to communities.
Yes,
the question is, and it's maybe not to yourselves you should be asking it, Rick, but if they provide a service to communities, well then surely communities has a shared interest in the cost of preserving them, right? And it shouldn't be left to the private landowners who some have inherited them or whatever. So the point I'm making is there, that there's a public responsibility. I've heard of people talking about the values these dams are to wildlife and to all sorts of stuff. So therefore, if it's a public interest, then the public there, I think, should be very much involved in the expended.
That's absolutely correct.
That's right.
That's absolutely correct. One thing I would add.
I'd like you to know the question I'm asking is, so these do provide service to public.
Out of the 150 reservoirs in Northern Ireland, there are only about 24 are supplying water to the public.
Yeah, that's right.
The other half of their portfolio is out of service, but every single one of the 150 provides an amenity, a wetland. It provides a use way beyond commercial use in that sense.
Flood attenuation.
And flood attenuation. So they all provide that. And maybe there's a case for a trust, a reservoir trust, like a wildlife trust, woodlands trust, whatever. It might be a case the Water Service want to sell half their reservoirs. Who will buy them? Because there's the cost of maintaining them. So it's a big, big issue. Big issue.
Absolutely.
And we have talked about it in committee, and we don't have a solution, but it is a big issue, and they should not be abandoned.
Okay, Albert.
Yes, well, I think everything's been said here. The demise of Hollywood. You know,
Only if it
it's
fails.
getting back to these potential risks. That fault surely must lie with planning authority or the other authorities who knew that reservoir was there, and allowing houses to be built on the hill in the face of a reservoir. And you do have floodplains, but never once did I hear of the risk from reservoirs in any planning application. So therefore, the thing you haven't factored in here is the cost. Are we going to be looking at the planning authority now going to charge the applicant for an engineer's report on a dam if he wants to build downstream? Now, the fault has to lie with other people instead of putting the blame on the owner. And we're quick to say that some of the smaller ones are in a bigger risk than some of the bigger ones. But if some of them smaller ones are reclassified, other than the reservoir,
if they were reclassified in so much as removed from within the requirements of the Act,
yes,
then that they wouldn't become a risk to the downstream.
Exactly, and why has not
consequence to
been
the
said
downstream
today?
communities.
Because that's clearly a thing that you can do.
However, it's a balance with your colleagues, the environmental benefit and the flooding benefit and the community benefit that those particular reservoirs actually provide.
Aye, but that's fine, but that wasn't mentioned here today at all. That you can reclassify, you can take them out of that, and that would spare the expense to the owner.
How do you mean take them out? How do you mean take them out?
Or to reclassify?
By abandoning.
To reclassify, you'd either have to bring it below, as Jack said, either bring it below the 10,000
Yes.
threshold or abandon it entirely.
Is that impossible to do?
No.
So it's something that we can do here.
Yes.
And that has not been set out as an alternative to the owner. And another thing that's been set out here, if we come in here to inspect these reservoirs, and I think some of the colleagues here have said that the cost to the owner, and if that owner can't pay, would you carry out your inspection and knowing that you're not going to get paid? Because councils have the councils, for example, under the order of derelict buildings, can't slap an order on you. We'll do the work, but we'll charge you. So are we coming into that sphere? I think there's a whole lot more here, gentlemen. We haven't teased out here within this bill. We have talked about all the costings and everything else, but we haven't really got away from who's responsible.
The owner is responsible. Currently, the manager is responsible.
How can the owner be responsible, with all due respect, if he was not notified or if he wasn't advised? Now, for example, if the planning authority has never come to him or advised the applicant on building houses or a multiple of houses in the path of a reservoir, are you going to tell me now that the owner of that reservoir is now responsible for the lives of those people downstream?
But historically, the owner has always been responsible
not
for.
historically.
It's an asset which he has, and therefore, the same way as if you had a wall and it fell over onto a road or fell over in a car, you'd be responsible for it. He has an asset which he has always been
Are
responsible.
you responsible for your report?
I'm responsible for the report. Our company is
Are you
responsible for a
the
report that we
yeah.
would do, yes.
But if anything happens over and above your report, are you responsible?
depends how that relates to what's in the
Exactly,
report.
and that's the same thing as,
Yes.
as what the owner of the reservoir say.
Yeah.
He will ask questions too, as you will if in your report. So,
But if you were downstream, if you lived downstream of that particular reservoir and that reservoir failed and you were washed out as a result of that individual, you, under currently the situation of common law, would have the ability to go and get redress from that particular individual who owned that reservoir
under common law.
under common law.
And do you think that would something be
Now,
done?
as a result of the Rivers Agency work, it is the situation now where planning applications, my understanding is that planning applications where there is a reservoir above it do refer the individual applicant to the need and the risks of that reservoir.
Right, now who does that applicant of that house get the report from?
A developer, say, that's a theoretical situation where a developer is building downstream of a reservoir. The process currently that developer would be required to go through is to carry out a flood risk assessment in order to carry that out. Now, you can check this with Rivers Agency, this is my understanding. They would be required to carry out a flood risk assessment, and they would have to liaise with the owner of that reservoir, because his reservoir or her reservoir or the company's reservoir would have an impact on that flood
Who
risk
pay for all
assessment.
that?
The applicant.
The applicant.
developer.
Now, what about the flood plans that you already have? That River Agency already
So
has?
that would be Rivers Agency. We don't have the flood plans.
Everybody washes their hands and keeps coming back to this man that owns the reservoir.
Can I take a
It's not
specific?
just as flippant a case of people washing their
No,
hands.
no,
It is a very serious
I
issue.
am being flippant in a way here, but I really do think that there's parts of this here we're not getting to the bottom of. Like you can redesignate a reservoir. That's in front of every one of these in your packs.
Very classic.
You can do that. That's in your pack. So,
But we have, in all due respect, we have been looking at this for weeks, Oliver.
aye, well, that's okay, but nobody's mentioned it today. In all
It's
due
been
respect,
mentioned.
in all due respect
It's
for
been
somebody you
mentioned
have
every
for
week.
weeks.
It's been mentioned every week.
Can you redesignate that reservoir if it's below or above 10,000 cubic metres?
If I could take maybe a couple of your points in terms of the reservoirs, I've already said if it's 10,100 cubic metres, it can be brought down below the level of the Act, but that has to be done formally. Unfortunately, with respect to your question, maybe with the involvement of a qualified engineer, and that has to be done safely, but it can be brought down from 10,000, say, to 9,900. You could also formally abandon the reservoir and take it entirely out of service. That is possible, but again, by the services to make sure, and would bring in the wider context of planning and all the other environmental features your colleague had suggested. Questions that arise out of that is, a reservoir 10,100 cubic metres to a reservoir 9,900 cubic metres in terms of if it did fail, albeit it's below the level of the legislation. What's the difference in the impact if it did fail? So it's there's a scenario there that there is still a fundamental risk with something under something under 10,000, something over 10,000. Could I take also your points on the planning? I think what has gone in planning, we as the institution cannot comment upon. Things have happened in the past. Housing developments have been built. In fact, take it very simply, things have been built in the floodplain. I know over the past number of years, Rivers Agency have been undertaking works and planning work that are to correct flood defects in areas that have only recently been developed around Ballygolly. There's another town that were recently flooded, and those were things the planning service hadn't actually granted approval that long beforehand. That is a consequence. That is something that has now to be dealt with around historical and legacy issues that have gone through in the past when maybe knowledge of flood risk and other matters have not been the same. In respect of your reservoir owner who owns the reservoir, if somebody comes along and wants to build a housing development of 100 houses, it should not cost the owner anything. It is the responsibility of the developer to undertake the flood risk assessment, pay for that all as part of his planning process, and that would follow the current PPS 15, which I know is being looked at in terms of an upgrade at the moment.
Now, you see in England there, you say you have 25,000 cubic
In England,
above.
yeah.
Why can we not start at that here?
Well, I think we tried to cover that in our paper.
Yeah, you did, yes. I
In the
know
fact
you did,
that,
but I want to go back to that briefly.
that
before I finish.
10,000 is seen as the accepted level, sort of the knowledge since the 75 Act of 25,000 was developed. Knowledge has moved on, and the 10,000 is around the level of reservoirs.
And are you bringing the 25,000 cubic metres that's in England down to 10,000?
That is certainly what was planned, although the Floods and Water Management Act does not actually state the lower figure. Certainly that was envisaged. At the moment, we do not know what is going to happen. The secondary legislation is not there. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. What I can say is Wales is going for 10,000, Scotland is going for 10,000. Initially, it's at 20. As for Scotland, it's initially at 25,000, but they intend to phase into to 10,000.
Phase it in over.
I don't know what the time period is. I don't have that information.
Yeah.
Scotland has the legislation in place, but hasn't actually enacted it yet. So the 10,000, they're still running at the 25,000 under the 75 Act enacted in Scotland, but they haven't. They have the legislation on a statute book, but they haven't pressed the go button yet.
But there for 10,000?
For 10,000, yes.
But they haven't brought it in?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, Oliver, just there is a reply from the Department of Environment from a planning perspective of this bill, something similar to what Stephen has stated there, and further other clarifications at pages 27 and 30. Table papers, or is it in the pack? In the pack, just so for your own information. What happens? I think, Alan, you touched on the low impact reservoirs. To a certain degree, the low risk reservoirs, to a certain degree, you'll be blinded on them.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable with that, or is that something that maybe?
We're saying really, don't forget about the low consequence. I mean, they're still there. The danger just doesn't disappear when you drop by a few hundred cubic metres. You know, that's the issue. We shouldn't forget about them.
So you're talking about the reservoirs that would lie below the designated,
Yes.
the controlled reservoirs.
Yeah.
But then there's also controlled reservoirs that sit at the low risk. Are you blinded on them? Is that something that worries you? Is that you lose sleep at night over them?
Well, I lose sleep mainly over. I've lost a lot of sleep in the last 50 years. I think we just have to be jolly careful. We may have been lucky. I think we have been lucky. We've had failures. The last one, Tildarg, above Doak, there was no loss of life. The upper one at Cregan failed. It was absorbed. It was fairly small. It was absorbed in the middle one. The dam at Keady failed way back in the 1800s. It damaged. It swept right down the valley, the Cusher, and it wiped out a lot of Keady. So I mean, they fail, and I think the danger is we can be complacent, and I think the issue is money. With the legislation, nobody is against this legislation. It is very, very necessary, because the public sector, the private sector will not address their dams, I'm afraid, unless there is legislation. And I think it has to happen. The issue is money. They need help. A farmer could go out of business if he has to fork out money on this scale to fix the spillway or whatever, and he just can't afford it. And they should not be dug through. You know, the logical thing would be to dig through them, and this is a danger. And the whole community loses these, and they are very, very valuable in the landscape and for wildlife. And as I said earlier, out of the 150, every single one of them has an amenity, every single one. And they should not be destroyed.
Yeah, so, Chair, on that point, so therefore, if they all have an amenity and they're of a public interest, right, then surely the responsibility can't lie with the private owner.
Well, I mean, you're going outside engineering here.
Yeah, I understand but I wish to make this point, and I have been making this point.
And you're absolutely right.
I think there, that there's a public responsibility, rather than putting the onus onto the private owner.
well, they have all these other benefits of flood alleviation, flood attenuation. They do absorb floods. They provide wildlife. They provide fishing. Fishing is the biggest amenity thing. And even the ones that are used for potable water supply, there's fishing in those. There's no boating on them. You know, quite rightly, there should be no boating on a reservoir for potable supply. But there's fishing. People walk around them. They are too valuable to lose. And the private owners need help.
I think you're correct. I think IC would be certainly very supportive of, it's outside our remit, but we would be very supportive of a grant aid system. The only thing we would comment on about, you say, the owner or the manager, the problem we see with the legislation, and it's through our consultations on the policy as it was developed, is you have to rest responsibility somewhere.
Yeah,
and unfortunately it rests with the owner or the manager in that respect.
And let's be clear, under common law now,
Yes.
the reservoir owner is responsible.
May I just raise your comment on you were asking about the low risk reservoirs. We did through the consultations on policy feedback to Rivers Agency, and they've taken consideration. We do genuinely believe that a low risk register or low risk reservoir has to be looked at some point in time. It can't effectively, we're turning our back on it, which is your point. Are we completely unsighted of? We, ICE, debated this largely in our committee, and the feeling generally was that it needs something, but at a downgraded version of an inspection. Certainly, maybe not the supervision inspections, but something that a qualified pair of eyes looks at it at some point in time and feeds back. It's very much so lower profile in respect of the fact that it is a low risk.
Yep, go ahead.
Just ask a very quick one, Chair, and thank you. It's the power of planning back to council, and councils are the owners of some of these reservoirs. There's a conflict of interest there.
Well, could I ask Jack to talk about Environment Agency and GB?
That's what, yeah.
Well, they have reservoirs and they manage those reservoirs. It's basically two hats, I think, and they do it well. I think because they're the enforcement authority, they have to be set a good example.
Fair enough.
Okay, Robin Swan.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, gentlemen, for your patience during this. Just come back to Ian's train of thought, if these are all public amenities, maybe Rivers Agents and the department should be paying for these inspections.
That's why I've been making reference to it, because they're sitting back there.
Maybe ask Michelle next time you see her. Gentlemen, just going on the line, there was a train of thought Oliver started with, just didn't reach finalisation. One of your engineers goes on and inspects a reservoir, gives it a certificate or a report of fitness, walks away and it breaches within 5 minutes. Does the engineer retain any liability?
I could take that under my sort of commercial hat for my organisation, and is that whenever you employ or whenever an owner employs an engineer, you require them under the standard of law to exercise reasonable skill and care. If the engineer has not exercised reasonable skill and care, quite frankly, the lawyers will take them to the cleaners. You will be, and it will be the case that, but you will have to get another engineer, and you have to go through the court proceedings to go through that. But certainly, if the engineer has got it wrong and has not spotted something you should have spotted or whatever. But that's why I think, and you've heard from Jack around the panel system, I'm mid-career. I've spent, 20 plus years after graduation getting experience, and I'm currently going for the panel. So I have to build up a wealth of experience before I can even get onto the supervising panel, never mind the two gentlemen to my right who are on the AR panel, who are at a much higher level than that. You're dealing with highly specialised people.
So unless you can get another engineer to say the first engineer was at fault, the answer is no.
You'll always get an engineer to act as an expert witness.
He would be a member of the same institute as the original engineer who done the inspection.
Yes.
But engineers are human beings and can make mistakes. They're not infallible, but it would be very, very surprising for a dam to fail shortly after a thorough inspection.
And you'd only carry liability.
That would be very, very rare.
Okay.
It probably would also last, for a period of time. If the dam failed 5 years after an inspection, like a full full statutory inspection and it failed, and you went back to show that the AR had missed something. I'll give you a scenario. I was at a meeting yesterday, and it was Severn Trent Water, and it was in fact, he was the gentleman who is their reservoir manager, used to be the enforcement person for the Environment Agency, and he has a policy of changing inspecting engineer each time, so that he's getting a fresh pair of eyes, that it's not the same person looking at it each time. And his current inspection engineer has picked up on one of his dams an issue, and it will be written up in the BDS, or the British Dam Society, running their biannual conference in Northern Ireland in September, and it'll be written up in one of the papers for that there was this particular inspecting engineer has said it's a similar spillway to Silent Valley, and it goes down and round the bend, and he picked up a concern with that, which has then prompted modelling, and the paper will look at, 50 years have gone by without somebody raising an issue on that.
So are you saying that's good practice to have a new set of eyes every time?
Some owners believe that it is good practice. Certainly, I think in respect of the supervising engineer, familiarity is good, because you're asking for someone to come along every 6 months and inspect it, and they need to understand it. Alan or Jack may be more versed in commenting, but that particular owner has a preference to rotate. I believe the people I mentioned earlier, Scottish and Southern, they do also rotate. They use a small panel of 3 or 4 engineers for their 90 dams, but they will rotate them round. If you have inspected it now 10 years, you will not inspect the same one in 10 years' time.
The supervising engineer is looking for change.
Yeah.
He's looking for change, and so therefore a degree of continuity, as David said earlier, and as Stephen's reiterated, continuity over, say, 3-4 years has merit, because they're looking for change, and the change is in the form. There are 2 basic things that change in the embankment: is deformation, some form of change of shape, deformation or leakage. Key issues for the embankment. And leaks, of course, are very serious, because soil is erodible, and the dams we're talking about here are earth dams. We have only got 4 major concrete dams that you're aware of: Spelga, Ben Crom, Altenhinch and Altenheglish. 4 big concrete dams. All the others in Northern Ireland, earth dams. So they're all erodible, and a leak, as Stephen said, once the leak starts, you might get warning, but soil erodes quickly, and therefore these failures are quick. The failure of a concrete dam is totally different. Concrete dam is lifted off its base with uplift pressure. So if Spelga ever fails, it'll be because it lifts off its foundations. Now, the uplift pressure on all 4 of our concrete dams is very low, and I'm monitoring those. It is very low. They will not lift off their foundations. The failure of an earth dam is different. It's erosion through the dam, internal erosion, and when it happens, then it can be quite quick. That's the worrying bit.
Alan, in some of your earlier comments, you mentioned that 30 years ago you've been involved with Water Service, Llany Water, and you've inspected all their dams, and they're pretty much at a good standard. Do you see this legislation as to be solely to bring the private owners into line with that inspection?
It brings us up to catch up with what happened after Dalgorog. Dalgorog in North Wales in 25 killed about 15 people or something of that order. The legislation didn't come in until 1930. I don't know why it didn't come in here immediately. It should have done. So we're in catch up. Luckily, we have had no loss of life since 1925. The 30s Act, there has been no loss of life from the failure of a dam in the whole of GB. There's been failure from the failure of loss of life from the failure of a canal, but not from an impoundment. And it's remarkable. I mean, we are killing people at a terrific rate on the roads, a terrific rate. And our record on reservoirs is fantastic. But here, we've been lucky, I think. But we have managed it. And the legislation is not just for the private dams. it'll bring everybody up to the same standard.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, if I could just bring you back, I've only a couple more questions, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time here. It's been very, very good and very informative. I want to get back to the actual operation mechanics of it. And you go out and you inspect, you supervise, and you see a leak in an earth dam. Is there a degree of discretion there, professional discretion, as to whether you propose or recommend to that owner that that leak, that reservoir will now need a monthly inspection for a year, £500 a go, or do you recommend straight away, you've got a leak, it could lead to something bigger, get it fixed now, and we'll inspect it once it's fixed, or in 6 months' time? Where does the discretion come in?
As Jack said, there's judgment here. It depends on the nature of the leak. On if the leak is starting to move material out of the bank, if you can see soil coming out of the bank, you start drawing the reservoir down, no question. You take immediate action if there are signs that the leak is causing progressive, we call it internal erosion. So you're eroding material and it forms a pipe, and eventually that pipe will get to such a size that you get a collapse and you get a breach. So if the leak is starting to move material out of the bank, that is imminent failure, and you do not mess around. So you bring the reservoir down, and this is what I said earlier, you want to have the capability within the reservoir to draw the reservoir down at a certain amount. Very roughly, you're talking about from 300 to about maybe 500 millimetres per day. Is those sort of guidelines. Depends on the size of reservoir and the catchment and all sorts. That is with nothing coming in. In other words, you have a pipe that will draw the reservoir down fairly quickly. Depending on the nature of the leak and where it is it linked in some way to the pipe through the dam, because drawing the reservoir down quickly may not be the thing to do.
Yes.
Because you could make matters worse. So it depends on where the leak is. Is it near the outlet pipe? Is it away from the outlet pipe? What is the nature of it? Is it moving material? So there are big issues there, and that is the judgment of the engineer to decide what is the best thing to do. But if it's a minor leak, you start monitoring it, and you ask, has this changed much? So it really depends on the condition.
But will there always be an option of just remedial works to solve it now, even though it may not get bad for an hour, 2-3 years?
Well,
is it? I'm trying to establish: is it a case, where an unscrupulous engineer, if there is such a thing, could basically say, right, I'm on a banker here, and I'm going to do 12 visits over the next 2 years. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Or is it a case, no, just advise you to get that fixed, and it'll cost you a one-off payment of whatever?
The engineer will behave very, very responsibly. I mean, we're talking here about life and death.
Yes.
And the people who become supervising engineers are invariably fully chartered. I think the bulk of them are fully chartered or equivalent engineers. They are very senior. They are probably in their 40s plus. They are mature people, and they realise how responsible a position they're in. It is incredibly important that they behave responsibly.
Yet, as you said, they are human beings.
Sorry?
They are human beings.
Oh yes. Yeah. Well, they could make mistakes, but I mean that's the price you pay for being a human being. But they are well trained.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll bring.
Again, if your concern is on the side of, if there's going to be quite regular inspection of this leak, that inspection, certainly in my experience, it doesn't necessarily be carried out by the supervising engineer. It's in liaison with the supervising engineer, but some of the owner's staff can be keeping an eye, measuring the flow. In some cases, you would put in some sort of mechanism to allow you to do even the simplest of put a measuring cylinder in and try and find what the rate of flow is. And what you would often try to do is to look at that rate of flow in relation to the upstream water level, see whether is it Is it the climate conditions that are causing this? Is it directly related to the water level in the reservoir? If you drop it down a bit, does it reduce? You know, you're trying to get information, because whenever you say, is there an immediate, let's fix it, you actually need to know what you're fixing. You know, so you need to understand what's causing this. Is it coming from the upstream side? Where's it actually coming from? Before you can understand how to actually fix it. So, you know, you are saying that people have to have the experience of understanding how reservoirs are built and how they work to understand how to fix them.
I think just say something on the unscrupulous engineer, dare I say it. The panel appointments are on a 5-year renewable basis, so the panel engineers have to reapply, and there are cases of people who have not been reappointed, and I do believe your legislation, your proposed legislation, covers for the removal of people from the panels. So I think it's covered.
And that was coming on to my next question, Jack, so you've done very well there. But does the institution itself have any disciplinary powers or levers?
The institution has discipline, but I've never known a panel engineer who's gone through that process or been taken through that process. But there is a disciplinary process where clients, you know, that have engaged engineers can take issue with the ICE about the conduct of engineers.
Okay. And the operating regime for high-risk reservoirs in England, how does it compare to here if the legislation goes through as it's written in the bill?
Could you just say it again, please? I missed the first part.
With regards to the regime, the inspection, the operating regime in England at the present time, how does it differ from what's proposed in this reservoirs bill?
We are playing catch-up, I think. We've moved over onto a risk-based approach, and that is coming in at the moment. And the Environment Agency is going through a process of reviewing each of the cases. So starting with the low risk to remove those that are likely to be in that category. We have a low and a high risk. We don't have an in-between. Yes. I won't say we've got it right and you've got it wrong. You probably got it right and we've got it wrong. I don't know. You may have a better approach, this in-between.
Okay. Ian, sorry, you want to...
Can I ask, in England, for example, private owners, are they helped financially or anything like that?
I'm not aware of any help unless they can get grants for other reasons. You know, if there's. But no, I think the difficulties that I see you discussing are very similar to what we see. You know, the ones that I dread as a AR panel engineer is where a reservoir has been in the hands. It's a fairly large reservoir. It's built 100 years ago, and it's in the hands of private owners where it has been in as a municipal water authority or something like this, because those structures demand a lot more maintenance and ongoing cost. And I sometimes feel that the private owner is not aware of what can happen. And you know, a relatively minor repair can see 50,000, and it can go up to millions. I mean, I just looked at one last week belonging to a water utility, and the two costs that they were looking at were 5 million and 10 million. You know, in sorting out a spillway, where clearly something had to be done, and so you know, there's large costs involved in some of these structures.
Thank you.
Okay, well, with regards to reservoirs, type of reservoirs, how do we sit with GB? You know, obviously we have a lot of earth dams dating back to the Industrial Revolution, the mills, flex mills, I would imagine. Does England have the same type?
We have the Pennine dams, would say very similar sets, similar age, similar problems if we looked at them.
Yes.
Closely. We have got a few others. We have got a newer generation of farm reservoirs which you don't have here. A lot of those will actually come into the low risk. But we have the ornamental lakes. We have particular water supply reservoirs.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation and your lengthy question and answer session. We really do appreciate your time and your answers here today and your expertise as always, because it's very important that we hear from all sectors here with regards to the scrutiny of this. You're quite right, Alan. You mentioned, I think, first, this is very, very important. Very, very important that we get it right. And certainly as chair, I've been ensuring that the committee look in every single nook and cranny and scrutinise this bill to its, each clause, line by line. So again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, members, just to move on then, because we are nearly wrapped up. Yeah, just to remind members that next week will be the last evidence session. Believe it or not, William, are you jumping for joy?
Then you get into the heart.
And then exactly we get into the hard bit of actually finding out where we want to go, what we want to do, and then even with regards to scrutiny line by line. So all that's ahead of us.
I don't know.
So
About it, you know.
okay. Okay, Oliver,
Yeah, I'm just sorting the wee thing out there.
okay, no problem.
All right.
Getting your reservoir checked out. Okay, David, thank you. So just to
Backhanders to engineers now.
just to make you aware, Oliver, next week is the last evidence session, unless someone else comes up. And I would certainly, if there was private land reservoir owners wanting to come up, I would certainly facilitate them, I think. But we've basically spoken to everybody that we can, that we invited up and who is willing to come to speak to us. So last week is the last evidence session, and then we'll get into a different phase of scrutiny. So I would ask you just to read over the bill once more, come back next week maybe, and we'll have to have a discussion as to what our principles, what our fundamental issues are with the bill, or any specific clauses even, or the fundamentals, and come back and we can throw it all into the pot and we'll see what mixture's made, and then where we go from there. Okay, members content.
Could I ask there, that is there any advantage in getting a presentation there from someone, to show to all of us the public interest or the public value of dams and reservoirs, the 151 dams and reservoirs?
Well, the lady coming next week, Denise,
or something like that,
Denise, she's all about the environmental aspects, and her fear is if these are withdrawn or decommissioned or drained, that the loss and the cost to the environment.
That's what I mean there, in the sense there, dams or reservoirs are there to catch water, Therefore, it's there to protect. It's not, they're there to protect water coming down on homes or families or whatever, right, or properties, right? So therefore, there has to be some kind of an element of public influence in this all, even though they are privately owned,
The committee did ask Rivers Agency, and they did go off and they commissioned a sort of community usage of reservoirs, and that came to the committee before your time, Ian, and I can dig that out for you. But every reservoir was classified as its leisure use, its recreational use, its environmental use. So every reservoir in Northern Ireland, they'd done that classification on it, and then came back and said what would be the impact if that wasn't there. If that reservoir was taken out, what would be the impact? So I can get that for you. It was brought to this committee probably a year ago, maybe more. So I'll dig that out for you.
Only trying to see if there's a way around, to compensate, if you like, or
My fear, the only way you can spread the cost on the community, my fear is the only way you can do that is through rates,
which is have to come from central government,
which is a big issue. So it's either taxes or rates, But anyway, are you happy enough then? Take that away and certainly come back. Again, we have had a very good session of evidence sessions. I do know that we have struggled at times to keep a quorum, a quota, but again, it's the members' loss, and they haven't been here. I can say that the members that are sitting around this room now have always been good attenders through the evidence sessions, so there's others that maybe not hasn't, and again, it'll be their disadvantage when they come to debate this in the Assembly, but there we are. Oh, okay, members, moving on then. We're nearly finished. Agenda item number 10, is any other business? Are there any other business?
One item, maybe, Chairman, that we could maybe try and get some clarification on, and it was raised at a meeting I was at last night, actually, to do with the cap reform. And it's where small farmers who have their land all set in Conacre, and there's been some talk throughout the department that those people could actually lose their farm ID number. That the farm ID number, that they could lose. Small farmers who are not farming and have their land all set in Conacre could lose their farm ID. Now that could have consequences in the future for planning. If they wanted to get a house for their son or daughter or whatever, it could then have consequences on that. So it's just to check with the department to see is there any truth in this to start with, but it's somebody from within the department who has actually been making these noises, and that's where the concern's coming from. So if we could get some clarity in that. Which department here, Thomas?
Could I say, Chair?
Dard department. From Dard, yeah.
This has been brought up. I've seen it at even you go to County Hall planning meetings in my own area. Ian has brought this up. We have actually passed that on to the Environment Committee.
Yeah, I'm on the DOE committee, and I brought it up last Thursday, I think it was. They're going to do a wee bit of investigating.
You've already raised that?
They have already written to Dard asking that very question. A copy of that letter was in front of this committee a couple of weeks ago, so we are expecting a reply shortly. But I'll chase it up again to make just to...
Mr. Chairman, I do think that you can hold on to your business ID number, and the reason I do think that is because on the form for transfer of entitlements, they asked you that question: do you want to retain keep your business open? And you say yes or no. So that's what makes me think.
Yeah,
that you can keep.
Yeah, but what worries me then is, will Planning Service not use the business ID number then when judging planning applications, and will they move then to a further definition of an active farmer?
Well, that'll be up to Planning Service. That will have to do with the department.
And that's the issue, you see, because at the minute Planning Service have actually evolved as the PPS 20, PPS 14 or PPS 21 has moved on, and at the first they were looking at what is an active farmer, and then they basically lumped it all into a business ID number. So they were saying if you have a business ID number, you must be an active farmer. But that isn't necessarily true. So it's how Planning Service interpret what is an active farmer in the future.
Well, I suppose we need clarity from both departments, but at least we need clarity from here to make sure that the farmers aren't going to lose it.
And this might not be resolved until it goes to appellate appeals. You know, case law, case studies put in. So, any other further business then? Okay, agenda item 11 is the next meeting, which will be take place on Tuesday, the 1st of April, 2014, at 1:30 p.m. in room 30, Parliament Buildings. I declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you.